The Russian army has once again come to the brink of collapse. This time it wasn't a platoon that withdrew from the scene, but a fully fledged regiment. There were no orders from above, nor was there an attack on the front lines. The silence in the trenches was actually an echo of how Russian morale had quietly collapsed. Russia's professional army myth has been buried in digital records. So, in a war where desertion from the front lines is so blatant, what victory could the Kremlin still be talking about? Russia's strategic encirclement plan on the northern front has failed. The Kremlin's goal was clear: to tie down Ukraine's defense reserves in the border regions, lock them into the area around Sumy, and ease the pressure on its offensive in the east. For this reason, a large Russian force expanded from around Belgorod and Graveron, and gathered at the border from the north. They crossed the border to undermine the flexible harassment doctrine and push into Ukraine's interior. However, they were met not with an unprepared defense but a planned counterattack. Ukrainian ground forces commander Oleksiivka had anticipated Russia's move months in advance. He established a strong defensive network east of Sumy, particularly along the Gridlock, Andriivka and Oleksiivka lines. The importance of this line was not only geographical but also strategic. Ukraine would no longer merely defend its border, it would launch a counterattack at the right time and in the right place. Zelensky and Sursky appeared before the cameras and spoke clearly. "We will no longer just defend ourselves." These words represented not just a change in policy, but a direct transformation of the command structure on the ground. The implementation did not delay. Within days, Ukrainian forces launched precision drone strikes against Russian outposts in the region. This was followed by small-scale attrition raids supported by artillery and drones. It was not a heavy attack, but a controlled tactical pressure designed to push the Russian side into impatience. The Russian side initially thought these attacks were a frontal shock. Therefore, instead of sending large reinforcements to the area, they tried to manage with secondary units to protect their positions. However, Ukraine's pressure lasted not hours but days. As a result of intense attacks, first Gridlock and then Andriivka fell under Ukrainian control. Both villages are located directly on the road to Sumy. This was not just the loss of 2 villages, but a breach in Russia's right flank. Now Ukrainian troops are at the gates of Oleksiivka. The village is surrounded on 3 sides. Armored vehicles of the 117th Mechanized Brigade are approaching from the southwest, while infantry units supported by artillery are advancing from the north and east, breaking through the positions. The Russian defense lines are beginning to crumble. The number of retreating soldiers is increasing. That sentence was the first link in a chain that would break apart behind the front lines. Drone operators couldn't keep up with counting the tank turrets. Despite 3 years of harsh conditions, for the first time, an entire brigade was breaking the chain of command and fleeing for their lives. The route of the tank column, which was being broadcast live to global media, was confirmed by satellite companies' subsequent footage. What was visible to the naked eye was this. The convoy turned around Gridlock, reached the Andriivka border, slipped into the forest line, and instead of turning toward Belgorod, veered north. However, Frontline radio traffic told a different story. Fuel rations had been reduced to 50 litres per soldier. Half of the ammunition had been left behind because the northern depot had blown up during the day shift, and instead of orders, template messages like "hold your positions" were being sent. When there is no hope left, the first rule is broken. The unit saves itself. Thermal images confirmed that they had fled before the engine blocks had cooled. They had no means to wait for a tow truck from their own ranks. The crew abandoned their armor 4 to 5 kilometers from the front line and blended into the riverbank. 1/3 of the attacks targeted ammunition trucks, 1/3 targeted fuel tankers, and the rest targeted portable radar and radio towers. The impact of each successful strike is felt directly at the front. If artillery batteries are firing 600 rounds a day, that number drops below 200 on the evening the depot is hit. Ukrainian analysts call this leakage logistics. Even if the point you hit is small, it cuts off the breadth of infantry and armored vehicles with limited fuel reserves. In the heat of battle, the red light on the engine gauge triggers a collapse in morale. That's when the escape begins. The moral impact of this breakdown spread across social media in just a few hours. Channels created by Russian soldiers' mothers were flooded with posts like, "The Sumy group is silent. My son hasn't written in 5 days." Lists leaked from a mobile storage center in Belgorod confirmed the shortage of fuel wagons. When logistics routes are disrupted by a swarm of drones equivalent to a train, waiting lines can stretch up to 60 hours. At that point, if the commander at the front has no fuel, the only option left is to order the tanks to dig in and wait. The fact that the machines pulled into the line of fire were not designed for trenches also accelerated the escape. The T-80 chassis is heavy, its tracks sit deep, and it doesn't dig in the rear to prevent movement. Once the fuel runs out, it becomes a massive target. Even the withdrawal orders, issued by commanders, couldn't reach the rear in time because radio towers were frequent targets of Ukrainian FPV attacks. The Ukrainian side did not use this situation merely as a trump card behind the front lines. It also turned it into a media strategy. At the same time, the headline that caught attention in the technical support packages arriving from the West was the land-based variant of the Magura V5 naval drones with extended range. The new kamikaze swarms, designed to strike fuel tankers, not in open terrain but at river crossings inside the border, were equipped with additional target classification capabilities, thanks to a software update. They could now distinguish between tankers, heavy tanks, and open wagons. On the contrary, Russia remains silent. However, officers on the front lines say that this expansion is militarily unsustainable.
Просим разобраться в данной ситуации. Нам был дан приказ командирам роты.
Vladimir Putin is no longer fighting only on the front lines, but also against betrayal within his own ranks. Beyond the trenches, another front has opened, where trust has collapsed and loyalty has been shattered. Russian soldiers are secretly communicating with Ukraine, leaking coordinates and even targeting their own commanders. Could this be a sign that the army is rotting from within? Ukrainian front commander Alexander Syrskyi has ordered a tightening of defenses, particularly along the Kamyansk line, in response to increasing pressure from Russia. In accordance with this order, the 210th Separate Assault Regiment and the 118th Separate Mechanized Brigade have launched active counterattacks along the defense line extending to the Orikhiv region. Ukrainian troops are not only defending their positions, but also exerting constant pressure to halt the Russian advance. But amid these clashes, another front has opened that could influence the fate of the war. The psychological and intelligence fronts are more active. A Russian soldier belonging to the 57th Separate Brigade in the Zaporizhia region secretly reported the location of his unit's camouflage T-62 tanks to Ukrainian forces. Shortly after these coordinates were relayed, the tanks were targeted and destroyed. The tanks were destroyed not only physically, but also as symbols of the Russian army's morale. This is not an isolated case. Numerous reports from the front lines in recent weeks indicate an increase in similar tip-offs. Ukrainian intelligence sources report that some Russian soldiers have begun sharing coordinates of troop movements, armored formations, ammunition depots, and even temporary command centers with the Ukrainian side. This trend is even more pronounced among soldiers newly deployed to the front lines. Some are resorting to sabotage, jamming radio signals, deliberately damaging equipment, or revealing the locations of their positions before surrendering.
Алло, здравствуйте.
Добрый день.
Это Украина?
Да, это Украина.
СМС-ка пришла, говорит, если хотите сдаться, можете позвонить.
Да, если хотите сдаться.
Western intelligence sources classify regular data leaks from within the Russian army as of the second quarter of 2025 under 5 main headings. These leaks are no longer random, they are disciplined, systematic, and at a level that will affect the fate of the war. The first heading is location data. The coordinates of armored units, artillery batteries, radar stations, and ammunition depots located behind the front lines are being directly transmitted. These GPS or GLONASS-supported locations significantly improve the targeting accuracy of Ukrainian artillery. Now, a Smerch battery is no longer hit approximately, but precisely. The second category consists of planning schedules. Details of defensive fortifications, troop rotation timelines, and position changes prepared within the command structure are leaked as PDF files or direct photographs of command boards. These documents hold not only military but also psychological value. Ukraine knows in advance when and where the opposing side is vulnerable. The third stream focuses on logistics logs. In particular, the barrel numbers of fuel convoys, the routes of transport vehicles, their transit times, and tables detailing daily ammunition consumption rates of units are directly reaching Western centers. This is invaluable data not only for attacks, but also for a wear and tear strategy. The fourth and more internal area is morale reports. Complaints sent by soldiers to their commanders, lists of dead and wounded within units, correspondence showing delays in salary payments, and frontline reports paint a detailed picture of the mood at the front. This information is critical in both propaganda warfare and psychological operations. The fifth and most dramatic heading is sabotage. Information is no longer just flowing. Actual sabotage is also being carried out from within. Some soldiers jam their own radios, while others remove the fuses from anti-tank mines. Some guns have internal barrel defects. And deliberately created recoil problems. These actions show that the war is being fought not only on the external front, but also on the internal front. 60% of this extensive data flow goes directly to the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense's special encrypted telegram bot called Surrender Hotline. 25% is transferred to joint signal intelligence centers of the United States and the United Kingdom. The remaining 15% reaches Western media directly through various channels. What is the reason behind this betrayal? It is difficult to explain the process leading Russian soldiers to turn their backs on their commanders and their state with a single reason. But behind the cracks on the front lines, 5 fundamental factors stand out. The first factor is a lack of trust in the chain of command. Since the harsh winter of 2024, at least 8 regional commanders have been dismissed. Although the official reasons given are corruption or military indiscipline, the reaction on the front lines is different. Officers believe that the chain of command is no longer shaped by the demands of war, but by political balances in Moscow. The perception that orders are political rather than military in nature is eroding trust in the command structure. The second factor is a logistics and resource crisis. By the summer of 2025, ammunition and fuel supplies had caused serious disruptions on the front lines. Starting in June, some units were reported to have been without artillery support for an average of 4 to 6 hours a day. In a war where their own artillery is silent and fuel supplies are delayed, the soldiers' morale is rapidly declining. What often comes at the expected time of support is only silence. Mobilization fatigue also triggers betrayal. Most of the new soldiers sent to the front with the third wave of mobilization were conscripted without the slightest idea of the nature of the war. Sent directly into combat after less than 2 months of accelerated training, these soldiers' perception of reality is based on short videos they watch on social media. The conflicting content they are exposed to on social media platforms triggers a reflex of questioning rather than propaganda. We must also mention the climate of conspiracy and fear. Disciplinary processes within the Russian army feed the perception that they are being sacrificed on the front lines. By mid-2025, over 1,000 soldiers had been brought to court on charges of insubordination and desertion. These trials have become a kind of warning, especially for those serving on the front lines. A soldier who sees his own officer arrested simply for opposing him now fears not only the enemy, but also the system itself. Finally, family pressure and insecurity are also fueling betrayal. Despite social media restrictions, Russian families are finding ways to learn the whereabouts of their loved ones at the front. In some cases, soldiers' coordinates are tracked via apps downloaded to their cell phones or SIM cards that are sold. But the authorities' efforts to conceal the losses have the opposite effect on families. As trust in the Kremlin rapidly erodes, pressure on soldiers at the front to come back or at least tell the truth is growing. Kiev, meanwhile, is determined to turn these voluntary reports from the front lines into a systematic process, rather than random gestures. To this end, the Ukrainian government has established a 3-pronged and highly sophisticated intelligence gathering mechanism. The first prong of the system consists of digital communication channels that are accessible 24/7. Special bots developed on Telegram are designed so that any Russian soldier can easily make contact. For those who want a higher level of security, an anonymous application called Surrender Chat, operating on the Tor network, is available. This system offers an accessible and untraceable way out, especially for soldiers who fear being monitored. The second step involves reintegration centers in Ukraine, where Russian soldiers who surrender or provide intelligence are received. This center, established in Poltava, is structured to operate not only in a military, but also in a humanitarian framework. Soldiers who surrender here are thoroughly interrogated under the supervision of United Nations officials. Those who pass the information verification process are issued an official humanitarian status document. This document protects those who surrender from allegations of war crimes and ensures they are treated in accordance with international law. The third pillar of the system is an openly attractive incentive program. Kiev offers personnel who provide critical information not only temporary protection, but also a long-term life plan. For these individuals, post-war status guarantees, permanent residency in Ukraine, or transfer to European countries are among the options being considered. For young, educated, and technically skilled personnel, this offer represents not only a means of escape, but also an opportunity for a new life. As a result, the system both enhances intelligence flows and deepens the disintegration within the Russian military. The Kremlin has taken panic measures to stop this erosion of loyalty on the front lines. The first of these was the deployment of strict control units called disciplined trenches. The task of these units was to confiscate soldiers' personal devices before they could commit treason and cut off suspicious communications at the source. But in theory, discipline turned into oppression in practice. A catch-and-judge mentality began to prevail on the front lines. Soldiers found with unauthorized cell phones in the field are sent directly to martial law courts. So far, 491 cases have been sent to military judges in the war zone. This judicial crackdown is further undermining morale at the front by targeting not only those who leak information, but all soldiers who have confidence issues. The second measure is technological. The Kremlin has distributed a new generation of RF jamming modules, codenamed Resin Signal, to the front lines. In theory, this system is designed to disrupt encrypted data transfers, but the reality on the ground is quite different. Resin Signal only affects messaging apps that operate on certain wavelengths. This means that a photo of a paper map sent from a cell phone or a classic MMS message can reach the other side without being affected by this system. In other words, intelligence can be transported not only with high technology, but sometimes with old-fashioned methods as well. Contrary to expectations, all this repressive environment and technological measures are also having the opposite effect. Some soldiers on the front lines, believing they will face trial anyway, are beginning to see surrender or leaking information as a form of salvation, thinking, since punishment is inevitable, at least I can find a way out. These developments are shaking the image of charismatic commander-in-chief and disciplined army that Vladimir Putin has meticulously crafted over the years. In Kremlin propaganda, the Russian armed forces were presented as a war machine managed from a single center with a fully functioning chain of command. But the betrayals on the front lines and intelligence leaks from within are eroding this image on two fronts. In the outside world, especially in Western media, every new leak is reported with headlines like, "Putin doesn't control the army doesn't control Putin." This creates the impression that strategic decisions are not made from above, but are shaped by morale on the ground and the instinct for personal survival. The Kremlin's message that Putin is pulling all the strings in this war, which it has been repeating for years, is becoming increasingly less credible. The picture is even more complex within the country. The families of soldiers serving on the front lines are losing trust in the Kremlin's control of information, as they see their sons' locations and even their dates of death being exposed on social media platforms. The question, if their locations can be revealed so easily, why are they still there, has become a daily query. Putin's powerful image as a leader on television is now giving way to skepticism in the silence of kitchens and living rooms. If these intelligence leaks continue at the same pace, the dynamics of the war could shift dramatically on three key fronts. First, artillery superiority could completely shift hands. Ukraine no longer fires blindly. It strikes Russian battery positions with centimeter precision, using coordinates obtained directly from inside the country. This forces Russian artillery units to constantly change positions and distribute their ammunition hastily and irregularly. Firepower decreases, accuracy drops, and panic grows. The second shift occurs in the supply chain. Fuel depots, bridges, or train lines that were previously targeted using reconnaissance satellites or reconnaissance flights are now directly targeted using information obtained from inside the country. As a result, logistical costs skyrocket. The number of soldiers and vehicles required to ensure the safe transport of an ammunition convoy doubles. Time is prolonged, risk increases, and the pulse of the front line slows. The third and perhaps most dangerous shift, a breakdown in morale. If the number of soldiers providing information from within or surrendering exceeds 5% of the total personnel, a psychological threshold is crossed. Questions such as, how many others are talking, and who leaked information in the neighboring battalion, spread among the soldiers. This kind of environment of distrust triggers herd mentality. Individual desertions turn into mass defections. The war begins to be lost not only on the battlefield, but also in the minds of the soldiers. Putin will probably resort to economic morphine in the short term to stop this trend. Pay raises for those serving on the front lines, extra compensation for their families, propaganda films with themes of execution for traitors. But all these steps have a common limitation: money. The ruble is now melting as fast as it is on the battlefield. Refineries ablaze from drone attacks, sabotaged railway lines, and now a wave of betrayal rising from within the front lines. Even the Kremlin's last reserves may not be enough to finance this new phase of the war, which is exploding from within. As a result, Moscow's narrative of a strong army and unwavering loyalty is now nothing more than window dressing. On the real front lines, it is not loyalty, but questioning that prevails. A soldier's armor can be repaired if it is pierced, but once doubt enters his mind, no amount of resources can fill that crack. Once trust is lost, it cannot be regained through propaganda, but only through a genuine sense of justice and meaning. If Russian tanks are being hit today not by enemy artillery but by coordinates coming from within, this is no longer an exception but the result of systemic decay. If the Kremlin cannot provide a satisfactory answer to the question echoing in the soldiers' minds, "Why am I fighting here?" then the direction of the war will no longer be determined by rockets, but by consciences. And those consciences are working in favor of Kiev, not the Kremlin. Thank you for watching. Once considered unshakable, the Russian economy is now a crumbling fortress. The war in Ukraine sparked this transformation. Military spending has skyrocketed, and Putin needs billions of dollars to flow into his coffers every month. And to find this money, the Kremlin has set its sights on its own wealthy, the oligarchs. Since the start of the war, Putin has amassed more than $50 billion from this small circle. A total of 102 private assets have been seized. The Strategic Companies Law, allegations of corruption, violations of privatization, and charges of ineffective management have been the excuses used by the Kremlin to seize assets. Will the Kremlin's internal looting strategy keep Russia afloat, or will it bring it down from within? The collapse of the Soviet Union raised hopes that Russia could transform itself into an open, free market economy integrated into the global economy. But widespread corruption, economic turmoil, and crime in the 1990s undermined confidence in democratic capitalism. When Vladimir Putin stepped through the heavy doors of the Kremlin in the early 2000s, the country was literally standing on a pile of rubble. All of the state's strategic assets had been transferred behind closed doors through sham tenders. A new class of oligarchs was born during this period. Oleg Deripaska, Boris Berezovsky, Vladimir Gusinsky, Mikhail Khodorkovsky. These individuals, who held sway not only in the business world, but also at the highest echelons of politics, were expanding their economic empires while amassing media and financial power capable of installing and toppling governments. Private jets, mansions in London, and the Côte d'Azur, billion-dollar accounts in international banks, and most importantly, They had a deep network of influence that extended from parliament to the ministries. The president sitting in the Kremlin represented the state as required by protocol. But it was a few rich men behind the scenes who determined the fate of the country. State institutions were governed by laws, shaped by the interests of the oligarchs, and political loyalty was bought with money. This was the backdrop against which Putin entered the scene. When he took the presidential seat in 2000, his first message was clear: the state will be a state again. He warned the oligarchs, stay out of politics, mind your own business. This created a short-lived, silent agreement between the parties. As long as the oligarchs did not cross the red lines drawn by the Kremlin, they were able to protect their wealth and continue to grow in the shadow of the state. In return, Putin provided them with legal protection and a stable business environment, and the country's economy grew steadily, partly due to high oil prices. The Russian leader saw the economy grow from $200 billion in 1999 to $1.8 trillion in 2008. According to International Monetary Fund data, the economy reached $2.3 trillion between 2008 and 2022. But this balance was fragile and cracked at the first opportunity. As Putin rebuilt the state around his own authority, he began to see these parallel centers of power as a threat. The conflict over oil giant Yukos, led by Mikhail Khodorkovsky, marked the beginning of the invisible war between the Kremlin and the oligarchs. When Khodorkovsky began calling for political reform, his billion-dollar company was seized, and he was sent to a prison in Siberia. This was a clear message to others. Politics was the Kremlin's monopoly. From that day on, either absolute loyalty to Putin would be shown, or the entire empire would collapse overnight. Boris Berezovsky also lost his reign for failing to show loyalty. Berezovsky was one of the most powerful businessmen of the 1990s. He was an academic with a background in mathematics, but he made his fortune in the wild capitalism that emerged after the collapse of the Soviet Union. He built a network spanning from the automotive industry to oil giants, airlines, and media empires. His influence was not limited to the economic sphere. He also wielded significant political power, to the extent that he had the ability to decide who would sit in the Kremlin. He was one of the most influential figures behind Putin's rise to power in 2000. Through his television channels and newspapers, he shaped public opinion and directed the pre-election atmosphere in Putin's favor. This collaboration was initially beneficial for both sides. Berezovsky grew his fortune as an oligarch who did not clash with the state and enjoyed the Kremlin's approval, while Putin projected an image of a strong leader with the support of the business community behind him. But the moment when the balance of power shifted came quickly. When Berezovsky began to criticize the Kremlin's policies, particularly regarding the Chechen war and press freedom, Putin's tolerance suddenly diminished. The state targeted his greatest power, the media. The Aut television channel, which he controlled, came under state control through pressure and legal maneuvers. His oil companies and other investments were then surrounded by tax investigations and lawsuits. In 2001, Berezovsky, once one of the Kremlin's most powerful allies, was swiftly declared an enemy. He fled to London, leaving behind a significant portion of his fortune. An arrest warrant was issued against him in Russia. He was tried in absentia. He spent his years in exile conducting political campaigns against Russia, filing lawsuits in international courts, and trying to maintain his dwindling influence. In 2013, he was found dead in the bathroom of his mansion in England. Official reports pointed to suicide. But his close associates and some investigators claimed that there could be a political message behind the incident. Thus, Berezovsky went down in history as both a winner and one of the most dramatic losers of the turbulent and ruthless power struggles of the 1990s. Vladimir Gusinsky, on the other hand, was one of the brightest names among the media kings who rose to prominence in Russia in the early 1990s. He was a former theater manager, but he quickly entered the business world in the post-Soviet economic vacuum. In a short time, he built an influential empire in both the financial sector and the media. His greatest power was the television channel NTV, which set the public agenda, and its extensive news network. Gusinsky was one of the few media moguls who did not shy away from criticizing the Kremlin in his news coverage. Corruption in the Chechen War, scandals within the military, and controversial state decisions were given extensive coverage on NTV. These broadcasts represented a serious challenge to the political climate of the time. With Putin's rise to power in 2000, the Kremlin's policy of total control over the media was swiftly implemented, and Gusinsky became one of the first targets of this new order. In the summer of 2000, the state-owned energy giant Gazprom entered the picture. Pressure was exerted to purchase a majority stake in NTV. During this process, Gusinsky was arrested on charges of fraud and financial irregularities. He was released after a short period of detention, but was forced to sign an agreement to transfer NTV to Gazprom. The Kremlin's move was not only economic, but also symbolic. One of the last bastions of a free press in Russia had fallen. As pressure mounted, Gusinsky fled first to Spain and then to Israel. During his years in exile, he supported international press freedom campaigns, but lost all influence in Russia. The man who once sat at the table with heads of state in Moscow had now become a figure who could only comment from the outside. Today, Gusinsky's story is remembered as a striking example of the fate of the media in Putin's Russia. And what led to the loss of his fortune, influence, and country was his courage to stand up to the Kremlin directly. Oleg Deripaska, the famous billionaire industrialist and founder of the Rusal Aluminium Company, is one of the Kremlin's harshest critics. Despite being seen as an ally of Putin, Deripaska openly called for peace, stating peace is very important, negotiations must begin as soon as possible. Of course, this sentiment is not isolated. Others in Putin's camp are beginning to voice their concerns more openly. Moreover, the fuse for an uprising against the Russian leadership was lit in 2023. The spark that ignited the rebellion against Putin came from his own personal chef. As you may recall, Yevgeny Prigozhin, the former close associate and leader of the Wagner Group, made headlines when he released a video condemning the war and calling for its end. This defiant act referenced the Wagner Group's short-lived rebellion in June 2023, which significantly damaged Putin's public image. The Wagner rebellion was a striking example of growing unrest. Rebellions, deaths, and the forcible seizure of property were the tragic end of the oligarchs. One of the sharpest tools of Putin's consolidation of power was the sudden revocation of licenses. A media outlet could be shut down overnight on the grounds of violating broadcasting principles. A bank's operating license could be suddenly revoked under the pretext of capital adequacy. The bureaucracy functioned as a silent weapon in this process. Import and export documents were held up. Goods were detained at customs for weeks, and licenses for critical projects were suspended. These delays had fatal consequences, especially for companies with international partners. One of the most effective moves was to force partnerships. A businessman would be forced to take a figure close to the Kremlin onto his board of directors, or transfer part of his shares, even if he did not want to. For those who resisted, a mechanism of practical warnings would come into play. Raids by security forces in the early hours of the morning, cameras waiting at the door, and news of accusations spreading across the country within minutes. In the end, the options were always the same: submit, flee abroad, or fall silent behind bars. For some, this story ended in tragic accidents that were never fully explained. The war in Ukraine completely shattered the fragile balance between the Kremlin and the oligarchs. The West's economic blockade hit not only the state, but also Russia's wealthy class directly. Real estate stretching from Europe to the Caribbean, super yachts moored in marinas, and billion-dollar accounts in Swiss and London banks were frozen one by one. The wealth that oligarchs had kept hidden for years as a safe haven is now on the Kremlin's radar. Putin turned this situation into an opportunity. The message, "If the West can seize your assets, so can Russia," was first whispered and then issued as a direct order. Some billionaires were forced to donate hundreds of millions of dollars to Kremlin-approved reconstruction projects in Ukraine's occupied territories. Others saw their companies nationalized under the pretext of public need or transferred to individuals close to Putin. Oleg Deripaska lost his luxury hotel in 2023, which was seized by the state for strategic use. Aluminum giant Rusal is now being forced to produce metal for tank and missile production. Roman Abramovich tried to remain neutral, even taking on the role of peace negotiator in 2022. However, Western sanctions forced him to sell Chelsea for $3.2 billion, freeze his properties in the UK, and repatriate a significant portion of his fortune to Russia. Following this, the steel company Erosion was transformed into a contractor directly supplying materials for military infrastructure in occupied territories. Mikhail Fridman is also in the same circle of pressure. With a fortune of $15 billion, he had built an empire in the banking and retail sectors. But in 2024, he came under pressure behind the scenes to transfer his shares in Alfa Bank to buyers close to the Kremlin at well below their value. Tax audits and sudden investigations cornered him step by step. Even Gennady Timchenko, one of Putin's former KGB friends, couldn't escape this wave. He had amassed a fortune of $20 billion through oil and gas trade via Gunvor and had become a loyal financier of Kremlin projects. Nevertheless, in 2024, a tax investigation was launched against him under the pretext of energy deals. Behind the scenes, there is talk that this move is being used to force him to donate hundreds of millions of dollars to the military budget. The year 2024 was a period marked by extraordinary revenue items in Russia's federal budget. Revenue from real estate and asset sales alone reached 132 billion rubles. Almost a quarter of this figure came from the sale of Rolf, the country's largest car dealer. Rolf was the undisputed leader of the Russian automotive market for many years. Point of class, with its extensive dealer network, import channels, and wide range of models from the luxury to the economy segment, it was a major player in the supply of vehicles to both the private sector and state institutions. But the company's fate changed due to its current owner's criticism of the Kremlin. Rolf's previous shareholders included the family of a well-known businessman who is currently living in exile abroad and publicly criticizing Putin's administration. This connection had already attracted the attention of the power centers in Moscow. Tax audits, technical delays in the renewal of import licenses, and financial investigations left Rolf operationally cornered. The sale of the company in 2024 was presented as a commercial decision. However, sources close to the Kremlin indicate that this was not a voluntary sale, but rather the result of political pressure. The buyer was also no coincidence. Rolf came under the control of a state-linked holding company. Thus, a strategically important player in the automotive market fell under Kremlin influence, and the sale price was directly recorded as revenue in the federal budget. This transaction is seen as an example of the nationalization strategy implemented by the Putin administration in recent years. So far, we have discussed the situation of the oligarchs. What about ordinary Russian citizens? The burden on ordinary Russians is growing silently in the shadow of the war. A family man whose salary remains the same but sees a little less money in his pocket every time he leaves the supermarket. A shopkeeper who reads the message "No credit available" on the bank screen, even though his credit rating is impeccable. The dream of owning a home, starting their own business, or providing a better future for their children grows more distant each year. As the war drains the state budget, the central bank has turned to interest rates to slow the economy's collapse. The policy interest rate, which stood at 19% at the end of 2024, rose to 20% by mid-2025. On paper, the aim was to curb inflation. In practice, it made borrowing almost impossible and pushed prices even higher. The government announced inflation at 8.5% at the end of 2024. But everyone in the market knows that this is just a figure on paper. But basic foodstuffs such as bread, milk, and potatoes are also rising at the same rate. By mid-2025, the price of a kilogram of potatoes in Moscow will be more than 3 times the price in May 2024. While the Russian government claims that this increase is merely a correction following record low prices in 2023, which was a year of bumper harvests, independent analysts and investigative journalists disagree. This gap in perception reflects a wider disconnect between the Russian state's official narrative and the daily reality of both agricultural producers and ordinary citizens. Bread, pasta, and grains are now replacing potatoes in most Russian households. These substitutes may provide calories, but they cannot provide the nutritional value of a diversified diet that includes tubers. Nutrition experts warn that if these adaptations persist, they could lead to irreversible health effects, particularly among children and the elderly. In a country already grappling with demographic decline, even marginal nutritional deficiencies could have alarming implications for public health. What began as a price distortion is now at risk of turning into a long-term structural crisis. Electricity, water, and natural gas bills increased by 10 to 15% in many regions in 2024. The average Russian's monthly income is around 73,000 rubles, which is approximately $700 at the exchange rate at the beginning of 2025. In Moscow or St. Petersburg, half of this goes to rent or housing costs alone. What remains is barely enough for basic necessities such as food and clothing. This situation is not the result of misfortune or personal mistakes. It is the natural consequence of a system that first consumed its resources through war and corruption, then quietly left the bill to the people. Thank you for watching. Russia is a country at war, but it is not only fighting against Ukraine, it is also fighting within itself. The economy has hit rock bottom, and the resources to cover the costs of the war have been exhausted. Soldiers on the front lines are struggling to find food, and shortages of ammunition and equipment are growing. Russians are now on the brink of a major uprising, saying enough is enough. While the Kremlin is turning to exploiting even the poorest regions to fill the budget, growing unrest in the streets is turning into rebellion. Explosions are not just lighting up Moscow's skyline, but also burning television screens miles away. In Rostov, angry mothers set fire to the military commissariat. In Kazan, protests against electricity price hikes turned into "No to war" slogans. And in Dagestan villages, a flood of coffins triggered calls for autonomy. Even the refrigerators of the low-income class in Buryatia have been seized by the army. The situation is that dire, and this is pushing Russia into the darkest period of its modern history. The deafening sound of sirens echoing across the country is no longer connecting the Kremlin to the streets. It is connecting the streets to each other. Every alarm sounds like a drumbeat of rebellion. Every explosion further eroding the myth of the invincible state. Where will this chain of collapse break? In the 8th month of 2025, the Kremlin budget had a deficit of 3.7 trillion rubles. This figure represents a budget gap of a magnitude almost unheard of in Russian financial history outside of times of war. As the cost of the war in Ukraine rises with each passing month, military spending is skyrocketing. Energy revenues are declining due to global price fluctuations and sanctions. The ruble, meanwhile, cannot stop its decline in value. Thus, Moscow's coffers are emptying rapidly, struggling to bear the burden of the war. The Kremlin's solution to close this gap has been to reach into the pockets of citizens at the lowest levels of society. Buryatia, one of Siberia's poorest regions, already has a fragile socio-economic structure with low income levels, limited production capacity, and high unemployment rates. But in recent weeks, local authorities and volunteer networks have launched campaigns to collect supplies directly from the public to support the army. Announcements made in the Zagrayevsky region requested donations of refrigerators to be sent to field hospitals at the front lines. However, the list of requests quickly expanded to include basic humanitarian needs, such as motorcycles, clothing, wheelchairs, canes, and even drinking water. A small number of people voluntarily handed over their remaining working refrigerators and other usable items. But this scene attracted attention not only because of the material aid it provided, but also because of the message it conveyed. Local residents interpret the state and military's inability to meet even the most basic logistical needs with their own resources as a sign of deep failure in both economic management and war preparedness. The situation in Buryatia is being replicated almost exactly in other regions of Russia. In Irkutsk, the local administration suspended bonus payments to a wide range of people, from teachers to cultural workers, public officials and educators, and transferred these funds directly to the army's needs. Although official statements say that these cuts are temporary, there is talk behind the scenes that they could continue indefinitely. A teacher's account clearly illustrates the scale of the situation. They said there was no money left for the SWO, that all resources had been exhausted. Since soldiers couldn't be paid, they deducted a significant amount from our salaries. In the Komi Republic, demands have taken a different turn. Authorities have requested that the public donate fishing nets to be sent to the front lines. It is stated that soldiers will use these nets to cover trenches, build temporary shelters, or provide camouflage. Thus, the assistance requested from the public is not limited to basic needs such as food or clothing. It extends to engineering and defense materials that will be used directly on the battlefield. At Bauman State Technical University in Moscow, the impact of the war economy has manifested itself in a more creative but equally controversial way. The university administration has offered students physical education credits in exchange for knitting camouflage nets. This practice amounts to a direct exchange of academic achievement for the production of war materials. Thus, the needs of the front lines are now being met not only by factories or volunteer workshops, but also by university campus curricula. What is striking is that the increasing economic and social pressures have completely transformed the public's motivation to donate. Those who enthusiastically supported the invasion of Ukraine in the early stages of the war and sent money to the front lines had increased their donations nearly fourfold by 2025. But this time, the driving force was not Kremlin propaganda, but the harsh conditions and humanitarian concerns faced by soldiers on the front lines. In other words, the purpose of donations has become less about supporting a political cause and more about helping relatives, friends, or neighbors survive. However, even this voluntary aid is far from solving the deepening problem. The people see that the cost of the war is constantly being placed on their shoulders as their living standards rapidly decline. Prices for everything from basic food items to transportation are rising, while wages are eroding in real terms. Public services such as health and education are deteriorating, and transportation infrastructure is crumbling. This situation is fueling growing silent anger and unrest, especially in low-income areas. Moreover, this anger is not solely driven by material concerns. Mothers who send their children to war also bear the heavy burden of financing this war. In Dagestan, where soldiers' funerals followed one after another, meetings were held under the banner of local autonomy, and the issue was quickly brought to the official agenda of the regional parliament. In Tatarstan, an imam said in his sermon, "If the capital declares war and sends the bill to the peasants, this is not justice." As a result, an investigation was launched against him by the Ethnic Policy Committee. Every time budget allocations are cut, discontent grows in the provinces. When the centre's power weakens, the periphery becomes reluctant to recognize authority. The anger on the streets erupted in Novosibirsk at the end of July. 3,800 people who participated in the Enough is Enough march were dispersed within the first 15 minutes by water cannons firing colored water. Memorial chains were formed in 19 cities with black balloons in their hands and the slogan, "Give me back my son," on their lips. In Perm, crowds protesting a 25% increase in the price of bread quickly switched to chanting, "No to war." Police offered those arrested two options: a fine of 600,000 rubles or voluntary deployment to the front lines. Finding men without passports in the city was nearly impossible. Most had left the country months earlier via Georgia or Kazakhstan. The losses were no longer just statistics, they had become a pain deeply embedded in people's homes. According to independent sources, the number of Russian soldiers killed, seriously injured, or missing between February 2022 and July 2025 reached 1.05 million. This meant that 1 in every 4 households in the country had a black ribbon hanging from their door. According to a report by demographer Pavel Yelizarov, between 970,000 and 1,040,000 soldiers had completely lost their combat effectiveness during the same period. While official figures still insisted on 45,000 casualties, the reality of the graves was undeniable. The Independent Civil Initiative last address identified 132,000 new military grave markers ordered between April and June, based on data from marble workshops. This equated to an average of 1,450 deaths per day. Local newspapers in villages now print obituaries on extra pages, while in cities the question, "Why the war?" is spray-painted on neighborhood walls. While state television broadcast headlines about heroic defenders of the homeland, mothers on Telegram still whispered the same words. The zinc box arrived, we couldn't see his face. Nevertheless, 350,000 people were called up in an accelerated draft to make up for the new losses. But the confirmed number did not even reach 50,000. Instead of long queues in front of the provincial police headquarters, there are silent voids. Young people rush from the passport line to the Georgian border, the Mongolian steppe, or the Helsinki bus station. According to reports, over the past 9 months, 310,000 conscripts have crossed the borders of Georgia, Finland, Kazakhstan, and Turkey illegally. Mobile border data shows that 22% of Russian citizens intend to leave the country. It is now the norm for families to wait at the door with their passports, cash, and digital wallets at the ready. An anonymous report from border guards says that over 120,000 people have declared their intention to leave the country permanently since the end of May. This brings the total number of war refugees to 1.3 million. The defense industry cannot find workers to replace the young men who have left, leaving production lines idle. The official unemployment rate still stands at just 7.3%, but this figure masks the employment illusion created by the war. The recruitment of military contract personnel has topped the list of most sought-after professions in Russia's open labor market database for the first time. Salary promises of up to 500,000 rubles are splashed across posters to lure young people from poor regions into the barracks. But for those who know the truth, these advertisements are often synonymous with two signs seen side by side on the same street. One is a banner recruiting soldiers, the other is an advertisement for a coffin manufacturer. In the civilian sector, the picture is even bleaker. The disruption of the supply chain for Western technology components has crippled production. In the past month alone, 1,100 medium-sized factories have closed down. The 68,000 people laid off in the automotive sector formed long lines in front of tax offices. Applications for temporary social credit hit a record high. The consumer front is also experiencing a severe downturn. In the neighborhood markets of the Leningrad Oblast, the price of a kilogram of potatoes has reached 90 rubles. Pensioners are calculating whether they can afford to buy bread when they go to the pharmacy to get their prescription drugs. The subsidized smart credit card project, which the government has begun to talk about, is being described as a QR code version of the coupon books of the 1990s. The crisis is not limited to income and consumption. The country's skilled human resources are also rapidly dwindling. Since the beginning of June, 47 rural health centers have hung signs saying, "Temporarily closed," due to a shortage of doctors. In some areas, the nearest dental clinic is 300 kilometers away, and a farmer writhing in toothache expresses his anger, saying, "Did I not have my teeth pulled to win the war?" Middle-class families are paying large sums of rubles to consulting firms operating along the Turkey-Armenia-Serbia route to send their children abroad. Demographic indicators are revealing one of the harshest reflections of social collapse. The birth rate dropped by 7% in 2024. In the first quarter of 2025, the decline reached 12%. Reports from maternity clinics confirm that expectant mothers are unwilling to raise children in an environment of economic uncertainty and social unrest. Thus, the economic crisis is quietly consuming not only the present, but also the future of the country. The wave of emigration is no longer just the desperate flight of the poor. The richest segment of the country is also quietly packing their bags. As always, the elite made the first move. Oligarchs are withdrawing their assets from Russia by transferring them to Dubai-based offshore trusts. In the last 3 months, $15 billion has fled abroad unregistered. Luxury villas in Rublevka have fallen to half their price on real estate portals, but the market is still frozen. No one wants to tie their fortune to a house burning with rubles. The central bank is issuing warning after warning saying, "You are disrupting the balance of payments." But these warnings are not affecting the appetite of law firms or the determination of buyers. Deals are being struck behind the scenes, synchronized with private jet departure times. In the corridors of the capital, the same phrase is being whispered more and more frequently. If the ruble hits 160, even those who stayed will start looking for tickets. But after the attacks in June, 117,000 passports were issued in just 1 month. Queues of vehicles at the Georgian border crossed 35 kilometers. Kazakhstan limited entries by imposing quotas on authorization visas. Even Armenia began discussing a cap on temporary residence applications on the grounds of preserving the male population balance. Andrei, 28, who left Barnaul, explained his decision in a short video posted on YouTube. "If I stay here, there are 2 possibilities, the front or prison. Exile is expensive, but if there is a price to pay for survival, I have chosen to pay it. All these developments are severely eroding the political image that Vladimir Putin has worked so hard to cultivate over the years. This is because Vladimir Putin's war on Ukraine, which began in 2022, was presented as a historic mission and rebirth of the nation, thanks to the Kremlin's skillful propaganda in the early days. Victory songs were played on state television and Russian flags waved in the squares. But as time passed, the cost of the war became visible both on the front lines and within the country. As months turned into years, ammunition shortages, losses of armored vehicles and drones, and even the inability to provide basic medical supplies dealt a direct blow to Putin's image as an invincible leader. The collection of refrigerators, motorcycles, blankets, and even drinking water from the people in poor areas, and the forcing of university students in large cities to weave camouflage nets in exchange for tuition credits, led to questions about the state's military capacity. While Western media outlets have documented Russia's bottleneck in high-tech weapon systems and spare parts crisis due to Western sanctions, images leaked on social media have spread rapidly among the public. Despite the Kremlin's strict control mechanisms, once seen as the guarantor of stability and order, Putin now faces criticism as a leader who cannot even equip his own army. This erosion of his image is narrowing the Kremlin's room for maneuver in domestic politics. As the living standards of the people are rapidly declining, the financial burden of the war is increasing day by day. Although this situation does not directly translate into victory for Ukraine, it does create a significant strategic advantage. Disruptions in the logistics chain on the front lines are eroding the Russian army's ability to carry out planned offensives and defenses. Ammunition supplies are delayed, armored units are immobilized while waiting for spare parts, and health and ammunition depots behind the front lines cannot be adequately supplied. The shortfall in the Kremlin's war budget is raising questions about its ability to finance long-term operations. This is buying Ukraine time and giving it the opportunity to use military and financial aid from the West in a more planned and effective manner. The Kremlin now has two remaining weapons: fear and the currency. Fear is fueled by tightened laws, police pressure, detentions, and long prison sentences, while the currency is temporarily managed by the central bank's reflex to print money. But both tools are like time bombs. The more fear is suppressed, the greater the pressure builds within society. The ruble's printed fuel inflation, and the money in people's pockets rapidly loses value. State television may say that everything is under control, but the empty shelves in supermarkets and constantly changing price tags send a clear message to citizens on the street: out of control. Air raid sirens have become a psychological barometer measuring the country's mood. Each alarm sounds like a hammer blow, eroding the ruble further and adding new cracks to the wall of people's patience. The fear fueled by the Kremlin's stick policy is backfiring like a chemical reaction. History has shown this cycle many times. In 1993, Yeltsin built fear by attacking parliament with tanks. But when the economy collapsed, that fear evaporated. Today, the economy is already evaporating, so the life of fear is much shorter. Russian history books contain the phrase, "The Russian uprising is a powerful phenomenon." But the picture for 2025, rather than whispering its meaning, screams it out loud. Bread is expensive, children are in the grave, the ruble is worthless, and drone sirens can be heard day and night. And past examples clearly show the outcome of this formula. In 1905, the first revolutionary uprising was suppressed with blood, but 12 years later, the empire collapsed. In 1989, the human chain of the Baltic peoples was isolated, but 2 years later, the Soviet Union collapsed. Today, that chain is being rebuilt in any square with the screams of a mother, the rebellion of a soldier fleeing the front lines, and the rumble of hunger. The only difference this time is that the chain is breaking faster than ever before in history. What do you think about this? Your thoughts are very important to us, so please leave your comments. Thank you for watching. See you in the next video. Crimea is bursting into flames. Ukraine's unmanned aerial and naval vehicles have dismantled Russia's early warning chain. Considered its invisible shield. FPV drones, launched from unmanned boats, targeted a high-speed landing craft, 3 critical air defense radars, and a secret radar dome on Mount Petri. Moscow's southern sentinels have fallen silent, and a major breach has been opened in the defense wall. Kerch Bridge was suddenly closed to traffic. The entire peninsula, from Jankoy to Feodosia, has been placed on war alert. How did Ukraine bring down this radar network in Crimea? And what will this move change in the next phase of the war? On August 7, the Phantom UAV unit affiliated with Ukraine's defense intelligence completed the final preparations for a complex and high-risk operation targeting the southern ridges of Crimea. This elite unit, which had been behind the deepest range and most effective unmanned aerial attacks throughout the year, had this time devised a multi-layered attack chain across the Black Sea. The plan was based on the convergence of unmanned speedboats infiltrating from the surface and FPV-class attack drones descending from the sky under a single command network. These boats, unlike standard reconnaissance platforms, were modified to carry bombardment drones capable of taking off from the sea, with rail systems attached to their hulls. Prior to the operation, the Phantom team analyzed the radar blind spots on the southern coast of Crimea, coastal acoustics, and the patrol cycles of the Pantsir S-1 air defense batteries step by step. Day and night tests were conducted to measure how the wavelength changes in the Black Sea would reflect on the waterline of the boat hulls. The hulls of the boats were fitted with a special coating that created broken reflections on radar screens instead of leaving a clear silhouette on the sea surface. As a result, Russian radars along the coast saw not an approaching attack platform, but the irregular glimmers created by wave reflections. Each surface boat entered the first turning point using silent electric propellers. The locks of the rail systems integrated into the hull moved into position upon receiving an encrypted signal from the command center. Safety hooks and silent launch pistons were checked one last time. This system was designed to enable the drones to take off without vibration even over the sea. The first wave of takeoffs was programmed to destroy the designated maritime target. This target was the Project 02510 BK-16 fast attack boat, a key component of Crimea's coastal defense system. The Project 02510 BK-16 was a symbol of Russia's rapid response capability at sea. Capable of carrying 19 soldiers each, reaching speeds of 40 knots, and designed for sudden landings on the coastline, these assault boats were the backbone of Moscow's special operations doctrine of hit-and-run missions. But on August 7th, in the southern Black Sea, this pride and joy was caught defenseless at the dock. When the Phantom unit's FPV drones locked onto the target, explosion waves rapidly spreading across the waterline ripped through the hull. Flames quickly engulfed all compartments. Whether the ship sank or was towed away with severe damage, the message was clear. Even Russia's most modern and elite naval platforms are no longer untouchable. With a replacement cost of $6 million, this loss was as much a strategic blow as it was a material one. But the real turning point of the operation did not take place at sea, but on the mainland. This time, the targets were critical Russian radars such as Nebo SVU, Podlet K1, and 96L6E. Though these names may sound like technical codes, their significance to Moscow was clear: airspace awareness and threat detection capabilities. The Nebo SVU was a mobile long-range radar capable of detecting targets up to 400 kilometers away, specifically designed to track high-altitude stealth aircraft. Podlet K1 was the front line of defense, specializing in catching low-flying drones and cruise missiles. The 96L6E was the brain of the S-400 batteries. Without this radar, the system loses its ability to track hundreds of targets simultaneously and create a 3D tactical picture. Phantom's chain of drones struck these three systems almost simultaneously. Within minutes, radar antennas were shattered, data links were silenced, and Russia's airspace awareness over Crimea was dramatically weakened. But the heaviest blow was dealt at an altitude of 1,200 meters above sea level on Mount Petri. Here stood a massive dome constructed to protect the radar facility of the 3rd Radio Technical Regiment. This dome was not only designed to withstand harsh weather conditions, but also to evade satellite reconnaissance. When Ukrainian drones targeted and destroyed the dome, they also silenced the strategic data from the radar inside, which monitored air traffic across the Black Sea. When this radar fell, Russia did not just lose a base, it lost its constant watchful eye over the Black Sea. The simultaneous disabling of 3 radars did not just blind the local garrison, it opened new corridors in the sky for Ukraine. For months, Russia was able to detect Ukrainian drone activity in advance and protect sensitive areas with its radar coverage in Crimea. But this advantage has now been almost completely eliminated. The disabling of the radars and integrated air defense nodes is creating large gaps in Russia's air defense architecture over Crimea and the northwestern Black Sea. These gaps dramatically increase the likelihood that long-range cruise missiles, such as Storm Shadow and Scalp EG, as well as much more advanced indigenous kamikaze UAVs, will reach their targets. Ukraine has been striking such facilities in a planned manner for years, but the strike on Apetri is on a different scale. This point at the southern tip of Crimea covered not only the peninsula, but also a wide radar surveillance line stretching along Russia's western coast along the Black Sea.
Попали, да, все. Вот, в районе Роснефти. Вот, заправка Роснефть на...
Breaking this chain gives Ukraine the opportunity to intensify long-range UAV attacks in an area that includes Russia's favorite resort cities, including Sochi. Indeed, there has been a noticeable increase in drone sorties targeting this region in recent months. The deployment of FPV-type UAVs here provides a distinct tactical advantage. Traditional air defense systems struggle to adapt to these platforms, which are capable of high speeds and low-altitude maneuvers. Countermeasures developed against FPV drones on the front lines have not been deployed with the same intensity in Crimea. This allows FPVs to find much more open terrain here. Even with limited countermeasures in place, these drones can reach critical targets and disable radar antennas, command posts, and mobile batteries. Furthermore, the total value of Russia's losses in the latest attack is estimated to exceed $50 million. On the other side of the coin is the Kerch Bridge. Following the explosions, military and civilian traffic on the Kerch Bridge came to a standstill. All convoys approaching the bridge from the Tumen direction were suddenly stopped. Russian railways announced that the line between the Kavkaz station and the bridge entrance had been temporarily suspended for security checks. But these checks went beyond a mere security procedure, bringing all military and logistical movements toward Crimea to a standstill for hours. Satellite data from the time of the incident confirmed the formation of a 3,500-car train queue north of the Tumen station. Visual reflections clearly showed that railway traffic had been physically blocked. Although the alarm lasted only 38 minutes, this brief interruption is expected to deal a heavy blow to war logistics. Disruptions may occur in the supply chain for the daily ammunition needs of the 29th Combined Arms Army. At Optine, one of the Southern Front's key ammunition depots, military freight trains loaded with 152mm artillery shells could not be moved until the evening hours. This situation directly impacted not only long-range strike capabilities, but also that day's artillery planning. The situation on the road network was even more complex. In addition to the reinforcements advancing towards Crimea, convoys of wounded soldiers turning north were also stuck in the same traffic jam. The disruption of traffic on the bridge, one of the main arteries of the medical evacuation chain, also paralyzed the healthcare system behind the front lines. Mobile medical teams mobilized for the mobilization were forced to wait on the eastern side of the Kerch Bridge. This reduced the chances of intervention at critical moments, putting the lives of many seriously wounded people at risk. The social and psychological turmoil lasted much longer than the explosions. Civilians living in Crimea were forced to wake up to 2 different alarm sounds in just 30 minutes. The first was the classic warning that the air defense systems had been activated. The second was fire sirens announcing that flames were spreading. This double threat that came with the night left residents defenseless against both the danger from the sky and the panic spreading on the ground. Some civilians living in Kerch said, "We turned into a closed box overnight. The bridge looks open, but no one can cross it." Such messages became not only a means of sharing information, but also a barometer of public morale. Since 2018, the Kremlin had been constructing a narrative of a security umbrella for those living in Crimea. But the explosions pierced this umbrella, both physically and symbolically. Now people are afraid not only of the bombings, but of the system itself. State television rolled out the classic script that same morning. The defense systems worked successfully. No targets were hit. But this rhetoric was contradicted by columns of smoke rising into the sky from different cities in Crimea. Visual evidence invalidated official statements, and the perception that the Kremlin is hiding the truth began to gain strength among the Crimean people. Even more striking is the demographic makeup of this population. A significant portion of the 2.3 million people living on the peninsula today are civilians who were relocated from within Russia after 2014. For years, the Kremlin has been telling this group that they are safe here. But now, alarm bells, smoke, and closed roads have shattered that sense of security. The most serious scenario being discussed behind the scenes is a new wave of migration. Some of the people who came to Crimea have even started saying, "If our homes are not safe, let's go back to a place far away from the war." According to press reports, many officers' families have secretly or gradually returned to mainland Russia. According to a report by German broadcaster Deutsche Welle, based on diplomatic sources, Moscow has introduced a priority quota system for the families of security personnel stationed in Crimea. Initially, around 10,000 people were targeted for relocation to Krasnodar and Stavropol. The partisan network reported that Bars reserve units were conducting secret patrols in civilian clothing in the bays of Sevastopol, that security measures had been increased, and that equipment was being hidden. Additionally, all leave days for military personnel have been cancelled. According to a statement by an ATESH agent directly linked to air defense systems, air defense personnel have begun evacuating their families to military camps in the southern military district. This evacuation order can be seen as a sign that the security situation in the region is critical. It is alleged that the Russian administration plans to evacuate approximately 250,000 people in the first phase, including military families, defense industry technicians, railway and port personnel, children, and the elderly. According to an analysis published by Forbes Russia, the Black Sea Fleet headquarters has a family load of 30,000 people, half of whom have already left between May and July 2025. In addition to military personnel, ordinary Russians on the peninsula are also leaving Crimea. Reports show that the number of Russian citizens who have recently left the peninsula has reached 100,000. With the latest developments, this number is expected to increase further. The total capacity is 40,000 vehicles per day in both directions, but after the explosions in 2024, traffic was reduced by half on the single support belt. The same situation is ongoing today. However, traffic on the peninsula remains gridlocked. The Kerch Bridge is also a risky alternative for those seeking to flee Crimea. This is because the bridge falls within the range of Storm Shadow and Attack MS missiles. Ukraine stated in May 2025 that it is maintaining its strike capability against Kerch. The railway section is still limited by repairs. It has been reduced to 2 trains per hour, or 4,000 passengers. In other words, all exits from the peninsula are about to close. The Putin administration has developed a 2-pronged response strategy following the latest attacks on the Crimean peninsula. The first step was to move the Bastion P coastal defense systems belonging to the Black Sea Fleet to the northern mouth of the Kerch Strait. Although these systems are technically equipped with anti-ship missiles and are effective for coastal defense, this relocation is more of a blockade reflex than a direct counterattack. In particular, the ban on unauthorized civilian vessels passing through the Kerch Strait until further notice has led to both psychological and logistical constraints in the area. Small tonnage ferry traffic between the Azov Sea and Crimea has been partially blocked as a result of this decision. Thus, not only military but also civilian supply chains have come under pressure. The second response came from the air defense wing. Existing batteries of S-400 Triumph systems were concentrated around the Kerch Bridge. But this concentration does not mean effective defense. Due to the limited radar infrastructure in the region, the classic barrage fire tactic cannot be used against cruise missiles such as Storm Shadow, which have low altitude and high accuracy capabilities. The systems often fail to engage the target, missing the missiles as they pass, and reports indicate that the defense ramps are being destroyed rather than inflicting damage after the attack. The Ukrainian General Staff's goal is not just instant damage, but constant pressure. In the last 6 months, a chain of targets has been hit in Crimea: the hangars at the Saki Air Base, a storage facility north of Simferopol, fuel tanks in Belbek, a radar node in Jankoy, and now the Afip-Kerch line. This sequence is known in NATO doctrine as a serial deep strike. It condemns the enemy to repair one target while another is destroyed. The repair budget cannot keep pace with the establishment of new defense units. Thus, Russia's fortification replenishment cycle slows down due to the growing foreign exchange deficit. This series of attacks has brought not only Russia's defense reflexes back to the table, but also Ukraine's vision for Crimea. The peninsula, long considered untouchable, is now at the center of encirclement scenarios, not only psychologically but also physically. Crimea, which was supplied via land links in the early years of the war, is now under pressure on three fronts: land, air, and sea. The Melitopol-Tokmak-Mariupol land link is now within the extended GMLRS range of HIMARS and M270 systems. This means that every bridge, road junction, and convoy is now a target. Meanwhile, sea transport is also unsafe. Bayraktar TB2 reconnaissance data, combined with the Akhunch's munitions range, is turning the northern Black Sea into a minefield for Russia. And the air. The Crimean sky is already pierced by Storm Shadow, Scalp, and other cruise missiles. The destruction of radar systems has led to a chaotic situation where S-400 batteries are defending without targeting. An F-16 fleet could completely change the picture. Jets taking off from bases in Khmelnytsky and Poltava, in particular, could create a closure that would leave no open window in Russian airspace, with 24-hour combat air patrol missions starting from the north of the peninsula. This would provide not only air superiority, but also a strategic umbrella for armored units to launch a ground offensive. But there is one clear prerequisite for this scenario: a logistical break. As soon as the Kerch Bridge and the Chonhar Pass are cut off, the flow of ammunition, fuel, personnel reinforcements, and even food for the Russian garrison of approximately 200,000 people will be largely disrupted. Alternative supply routes are either risky by sea or under the shadow of HIMARS on the land side. Looking at the focus of today's attacks, it is clear that these critical logistical points are being targeted. In summary, whether Crimea will truly return remains to be seen. What are your thoughts on this matter? We would appreciate it if you could share your opinions in the comments. Thank you for watching. Let's cite. Supply lines in the Belgorod and Graveron regions are constantly under drone attack. Fuel and ammunition convoys are being destroyed before they reach the front lines. This is pushing Russian forces on the Sumy line into a serious logistical crisis. However, despite the stability in casualties, such a large loss of territory points to another problem. The Kremlin is not sending reinforcements. More accurately, it does not want to send them. This is because there are those who believe that plans to open a new front, or the current southern defense, are a higher priority. Military planners in Kyiv are closely monitoring these developments. The fall of Oleksiivka, following Kindrativka and Andriivka, would shift the 30-kilometer defense line along the Sumy axis in Ukraine's favor. Moreover, this area is only 18 kilometers from the border crossing of the railway line leading directly to Belgorod. If Ukrainian forces reach this depth, Russia's logistical transfers from the north to the inner lines of the front will be paralyzed. However, satellite images cast doubt on this claim. Tanks were left abandoned on the so-called rotation route, and personnel had scattered into the forest, neither regular nor controlled. ISW's rapid analysis also revealed another shortcoming. The retreating column had left its logistics convoys on the same route defenseless, so the escape was not merely tactical, it was dragging logistics into chaos. The most heavily targeted point of the supply tunnel stretching from Belgorod to Sumy is a 3-kilometer stretch of forest-shaded road. Ukrainian drone pilots are not tracking thermal signatures. They are targeting the contours of the tanker's hull, not the engine's heat. Hiding such a simple signature is nearly impossible. That's why the Russian side deployed camouflage nets and mobile jammers. But the jammers' energy requirements created a separate fuel line. The generators attached to the courier trucks couldn't reach the target area on the day of the attack. It's a vicious cycle. You need fuel to bring fuel, and when you can't replace the fuel you've used, the cycle stops. Ukraine's advance in Sumy may seem like a small, unmarked road on a military map. However, when the factor of moral decay is taken into account, it becomes enormous. Strategists in Kiev say that, by the end of summer, the targeted encirclement will leave 50,000 troops gasping for breath. Is this number exaggerated? Perhaps 10,000 to 15,000 will retreat, and 10,000 will surrender. But what matters is not the cost of bringing back the survivors, but the cost of the tanks, artillery, and equipment left behind. Russia claimed to have 3,000 active tanks at the start of the war, but the number of modern tanks currently seen on the battlefield is less than 1,000. When even T-55s are being pulled out of storage to make up for losses, the motivation to fight is hitting rock bottom. This is what Ukraine wants: to cut off the economic and psychological sinews of war of its opponent. The morale of Ukrainian troops on the front lines has not been this high in a long time. Commanders are no longer trying to push back armored brigades. They are organizing the safe surrender of crews inside armored vehicles that have raised the white flag. The breakdown of Russia's logistics network in Sumy is sending a delayed shockwave to Donbass, because when fuel and ammunition supplies from the north run out, the train schedule for replenishing the artillery stocks used in the south is disrupted. Russia's possible response boils down to two options. Either it will slow down the southern offensive to pump fuel and ammunition back to the northern front, or it will establish a partial bypass from depots in Belarus to the northern front. The first option would buy time for Donbass. The second would cast doubt on Belarus's claim of neutrality. Vladimir Putin needs a new round of mobilization to maintain troop levels in Ukraine. Every desertion is like cutting off one of the Moscow army's lifelines. The road ahead for Ukraine is now much clearer. The task ahead is not only to gain territory, but to systematically deplete Russia's economic and military resources. The main goal is to turn Russia's long war strategy against itself. To this end, Ukraine has three main priorities. First, to maintain or increase casualty rates at current levels. In recent weeks, Russia has been suffering around 8,000 casualties per week, and this number has begun to shake the Kremlin's personnel cycle. As long as Ukraine maintains this level, Russia's efforts to find soldiers will become even more difficult. The front lines that Moscow is trying to fill with its volunteer contract system will soon collapse in terms of both manpower and morale. The second priority is to expand deep strike capabilities. Attacks should be increased not only on the front lines, but also on logistics, command and production centers within Russia. Military industrial facilities, ammunition depots, railway junctions and fuel stocks in regions such as Rostov, Belgorod, Voronezh, Bryansk and Kursk should become priority targets for Ukraine's unmanned aerial vehicles and sabotage teams. This strategy is the most effective way to shape Russia from within. The third and most critical task is to target everything that is expensive. This is because Russia has already shifted to a full-fledged war economy. However, although this economy appears strong from the outside, it is experiencing serious problems in obtaining sensitive parts, semiconductors, optical sensors, and modern equipment due to Western sanctions. In short, there is no shortage of targets. When Ukraine systematically takes these high-cost targets out of commission, Russia will collapse not only on the battlefield, but also in its defense industry. The situation developing in favor of Ukraine on the Sumy axis has now gained irreversible momentum. The liberation of Kindrativka and Andriivka, and the complete encirclement of Oleksiivka show that Ukraine is on the verge of gaining strategic control in the north. If Oleksiivka falls, Ukraine will have completely eliminated the direct threat around Sumy. This means a new window of opportunity. What's next? Commander Syrsky's next target is increasingly likely to be Vovchansk. This region, located in the northeast of the Kharkiv Oblast, is still under Russian control. However, it is of high strategic importance. Both the connection line with Belgorod and the frontline support towards Kupiansk converge here. Recapturing Vovchansk could collapse Russia's entire defensive depth in the Kharkiv region. Moreover, the psychological importance of Kharkiv cannot be overlooked. Partially occupied in 2022 and later liberated by Ukraine's rapid offensive, this region remains a matter of pride for Russia. The fall of Vovchansk would shatter the Kremlin's perception that we can at least hold on to what we've taken. We don't want to leave you hanging with all this information. In your opinion, how will the Kremlin try to cover up this logistical balloon that exploded in Sumy? A longer war or a new retreat plan behind closed doors? Whatever your thoughts, we look forward to discussing them in the comments. And if you don't want to miss these pivotal moments, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. Because in the coming weeks, new stories, stretching from the Sumy forests to the Kursk deadlock, will continue to track not the pulse of the war, but the pulse of strategy. Thank you for watching. Russia's southern front plans were thrown into disarray by a single bombing order. The Ukrainian Air Force destroyed a vital border crossing in Zaporizhia, with JDAM-ER bombs dropped from MiG-29s. This crossing was not just a bridge, It was the military backbone connecting Crimea, Mariupol, and Dnipro. Now that backbone has been broken. Munition shipments have stopped. Fuel convoys have been cut off. The Kremlin's summer offensive collapsed before it even began. Can Russia compensate for this setback? On July 7, a Ukrainian MiG-29 fighter jet targeted a vital Russian crossing point over the Karachukrak River in the Zaporizhia region. This bridge was no ordinary structure. Although not the main branch of the Dnipro River, it served as a key link in the Russian army's supply chain on the southern front. Heavy fuel tankers, trucks loaded with ammunition, and armored repair convoys regularly crossed this crossing every day, feeding the logistics line stretching from Tokmak to Melitopol, and from there to Crimea via Kinburn. This route, considered an alternative to the Kerch Bridge, was critical for the transfer of cargo to eastern ports in particular. In the spring, Russia built a temporary but structurally sound military bridge over the Karachukrak to reinforce this route. Supported by concrete slabs, this structure allowed heavy vehicles to safely cross the marshy ground. An average of 230 vehicles used this route daily, with 1/3 of them directly supplying ammunition to the front lines. The remaining transportation handled fuel and food logistics. This is precisely why Ukraine did not hesitate in its target selection. The attack was not a conventional air operation, but was carried out using 2 GBU-62 bombs, equipped with advanced JDAM-ER guidance kits. These bombs were modernized versions of the US-produced 1,000-pound Mk-83. Thanks to the GPS-guided kit added to the tail section and the deployed flaps, these bombs can reach a range of over 70 kilometers and hit targets with accuracy of just a few meters. Normally, Soviet-designed MiG-29s were not equipped with the necessary interface to use these bombs, but Ukraine introduced Western munitions to these aircraft with a special adaptation kit developed in Lviv. The pilot can now see the range and targeting data of NATO-inventoried smart weapons on the cockpit display. This transforms an old jet into a modern precision strike platform. As a result of the attack, the temporary military bridge was completely disabled. One of the factors that made the attack so effective was not only the precision of the munitions used, but also the systematic air defense suppression operation carried out prior to the operation. In particular, the Russian Army's Buk M2 medium-range air defense systems deployed in the region were disabled by successive suppression of enemy air defenses attacks in recent weeks. Despite having an effective radar lock range of up to 45 kilometers, these systems were either detected and destroyed or rendered blind due to their radar frequencies being jammed. As a result, Ukraine's MiG-29s were able to advance through an open-air corridor as they approached the range to launch JDAM-ER bombs. The second and less talked-about effect of the operation was not limited to the destruction of the bridge. This bridge was not just a crossing point, it also served as a buffer zone, masking the logistics hub of the Russian 35th Corps on the eastern bank. Hidden behind the fog of war, this staging area was now exposed and vulnerable. Satellite imagery and heat signature data indicate that smoke rose from 3 separate camp areas shortly after the attack. This likely indicates secondary explosions in ammunition or fuel depots. Following the attack, the eastern ramp of the bridge was completely collapsed into the sea, with concrete blocks blocking the inner roadway. This structural collapse not only stopped traffic, but also wiped Russia's critical supply route from Mariupol to Crimea off the map. They now have to detour from Tokmak to Berdyansk to reach the east of the Dnipro. But this new route means an additional 160 kilometers and a loss of time. Moreover, this secondary route is extremely unfavorable in terms of both geography and infrastructure. Consisting of a narrow strip of earth, this passage quickly turns to mud, especially during summer rains. In such conditions, heavy fuel trucks could get stuck on the road, with their wheels sinking into the mud. This is not merely a physical disruption, but a collapse of the logistics chain. Because the fuel needed to reach the tank's tank is being used to charge a satellite phone, used to call for a crane. On the military side, another panic has emerged. After the bridge was hit, Ukraine demonstrated that its long-range JDAM-ER munitions could easily strike the rear of the front lines, forcing the Russian Air Force to respond urgently. Su-30 SM fighter jets were moved to the vicinity of Melitopol, and day and night patrol flights were launched on the Oleksiivka-Melitopol line. But these aircraft cannot fly above 4,000 meters to avoid entering the radar range of Ukraine's Patriot systems, which are equipped with AIM-120 AMRAAM missiles. This limits both their field of view and their attack position. There are patrol flights, but there is no real threat of a raid or suppression. The S-400 air defense batteries are scattered in a rather haphazard manner against this new threat. According to data obtained from satellite images, these batteries are mounted on temporary ramps that are constantly being moved rather than being placed in fixed positions. The aim is to prevent the destruction of all radar and command units with a single hit. This portability brings with it another problem. The radars cannot operate at the optimum altitude. In addition, Russian defense forces have deployed CRBN masking systems to make it more difficult for JDAM-ER munitions to target them. These systems reduce visibility by deflecting radar signals rather than suppressing them, but this appears to have seriously slowed down coordination and the chain of command on the ground. The impact of the attack has been much deeper and more multifaceted than meets the eye. With the bridge out of commission, the Russian command realized that it could not reinforce its front lines in Mariupol with BMP-3 armored vehicles, which were running on low fuel reserves. With the road link cut off, the solution shifted to air transport. The first reflex was to deploy Il-76 military transport aircraft. These flights via Kerch carried spare engine parts, sets of tracks, and emergency ammunition. But this method created two major problems. First, large targets such as the Il-76 are very easy to detect by Western radar systems, which means that the risk of air defense is immediately sky high. The second is economic. Each ton transported by Il-76 costs 3 times as much as the same load transported by truck. The cargo carried by Russia's logistics network on its southern front is no longer limited to ammunition and fuel. The Ministry of Agriculture's seasonal supply line from Donbass to Crimea has also been directly affected. Trucks traveling along this route transported grain, vegetables, meat products and milk to food warehouses in Crimea, returning with empty pallets, crates and waste packaging. But the destruction of the temporary bridge over the Karachakrak disrupted the two-way flow of this route. In particular, large refrigerated trailers are now forced to take a 160-kilometer detour via Berdyansk as an alternative route. Fuel consumption for trucks on this new route has nearly doubled. Logistics companies can no longer afford these extra costs. Many subcontractors have started to report losses. Civilian suppliers are directly sending invoices to the government, stating, "If prices on the shelves in Crimea do not increase by 18%, we cannot cover these costs." One of Russia's most trusted lifelines in the war is being cut off. The railway network is collapsing step by step. The line stretching from Volgograd to Rostov, from Kotelnikovo to Salsk, and from Archida to Kamenolomny has been severely damaged by Ukrainian drone attacks. This is not just about a few stations being out of service. It means the critical logistical backbone carrying ammunition, fuel, and troops to the southern front is being shattered. Wagons are stranded mid-journey, locomotives are silent, and the supply chain is paralyzed. Railway lines stretching from Donbass to Crimea and from St. Petersburg to the Caucasus are no longer safe. If trains come to a halt in the war, how will Russia advance on the front lines? On August 4th, a salvo of Ukrainian Lyuty-Boba drones targeted the Archida railway station in the town of Frolovo, located in Russia's Volgograd region. During the nighttime attack, multiple drones simultaneously targeted the station complex. One of them struck the control room responsible for signal and traffic control. Within seconds, the electrical system collapsed, signaling was disabled, and all train movements in the area were suspended. However, the real damage occurred when one of the ammunition-laden wagons parked on the main line was hit. The explosion was so powerful that it was heard in nearby villages. The fire quickly spread around the station. The infrastructure around the station was completely destroyed. Words alone cannot describe this scene. You must see it for yourself. For this reason, we are sharing footage recorded by civilians who were at the scene immediately after the attack. The chain reaction of the attack also disrupted the regional transportation system. Airports in Volgograd and Tambov temporarily suspended flight arrivals and departures for security reasons. The difficulties faced by search and rescue and firefighting teams in reaching the area once again highlighted how sudden and effective the attack was. Archida station is located at a critical point for regional military train transportation, where the line from Rostov branches off toward Volgograd. Convoys carrying fuel, armored vehicles and personnel to the front lines were being dispatched via this route. Therefore, this attack is not only physical destruction, but also a strategic blow to the supply continuity of Russian forces on the southern front. Just 3 days before this attack, the Kotelnikovo station was also targeted by Ukrainian attacks. Unmanned aerial vehicles targeted the station's traction transformer. The power supply was cut off and the system collapsed. This was literally the same principle as life stops when the water stops flowing in the body, because the trains moving along the tracks are powered by the energy from this system. And when the energy stops, the entire logistics chain grinds to a halt. Kotelnikovo may be 400 kilometers away from the front line, but it is no longer a security line. For in modern warfare, the concept of range has changed. Ukrainian drones are easily penetrating Russia's inner depths. Despite this, Volgograd governor Andrei Bocharov sought to downplay the situation, claiming that the fires had started from dry grass. However, this statement was quickly debunked by OSINT experts and satellite data. Open-source intelligence analysts like Tatarigami confirmed the presence of high temperatures and intense fires in the transformer area using heat signatures from NASA's firm's satellite system. Just 12 hours before the Kotelnikovo attack, a fuel supply facility in Sochi was struck. The burning depots contained not only the Sochi International Airport's backup fueling area, but also JP-8 fuel stocks that supplied the Black Sea Fleet's small patrol boats and reconnaissance vessels. It took 9 hours to extinguish the fire, but the real damage was in liquid form, 12,000 tons of jet fuel vaporized. The negative scenario for the Kremlin does not end here. On July 29th, unmanned aerial vehicles were again deployed in Salsk. This time, a fuel train was directly targeted. Flames engulfed the wagons, rendering the storage areas unusable. On the same night, the power plant in Orlovsky was taken offline. The attack on the transformer station in Zhutovo on July 27th followed the same pattern. When you look at the map, the lines become clear. Kotelnikovo, Salsk, Zhutovo, Kamienolongny, Novocherkassk. All are stops along the same route. Aligned along the same strategic backbone, embedded within the same attrition algorithm. Volgograd is not merely a transit hub connecting St. Petersburg to the Caucasus. It also lies at the heart of an energy corridor that enables crude oil from the northern ports of Arkhangelsk to be transported by land to the tanker terminal in Rostov, and from there, via pipeline to the Novorossiysk refinery on the Black Sea coast. Thus, the Volgograd station is the intersection point of both military and economic transportation routes. This is precisely why it is vulnerable. Figures provided in the Russian Ministry of Defense's 2024 Logistics Inspection Report vividly illustrate how this strategic hub has been utilized throughout the war. Since the start of the war, an average of 540 armored vehicles have been transported to the front lines via the Volgograd-Rostov route each week. Of these, 25% were T-72 and T-80 tanks, 33% were ammunition-carrying trucks, and the remainder consisted of fuel tankers and maintenance repair wagons. Even a 3-day disruption of this route would mean a delay of up to 40% in weekly fuel shipments to a division in Donetsk or Zaporizhia. Fuel shortages directly limit not only maneuverability, but also the intensity of artillery fire. The tactical mission cycles of the Air Force are directly linked to the number of aircraft that can take off from the runway. For this reason, ISW's analysis report noted that the attacks on the Volgograd line were not just sabotage, but a strategic shift. The report clearly states, Ukraine has moved to the stage of collapsing the Russian army's logistical nerve center without forcing it to open a second land front. The damage caused by the Sochi attack goes beyond a mere fire, directly striking the energy backbone that sustains the military mobility of the Black Sea. At this strategic storage complex owned by Rosneft, approximately 9,000 tons of fuel were being transported daily to Russia's southern military region and naval forces via direct shipping pumps. According to satellite images, 3 large fuel tanks were completely destroyed by the attack and rendered unusable. The 4th tank sustained serious structural damage and lost its operational capacity. This loss is expected to slow down the supply line to the Black Sea Fleet via Tuapse for at least 10 days. However, for Ukraine, this is not limited to triggering a temporary disruption. Ukraine has dealt a major blow to the Russian Air Force. 5 Russian warplanes were shot down over Crimea. Each one is now a pile of scrap metal worth approximately $35 to $50 million, lying in smoke along the Black Sea coast. This is not just an operation, it is a strategic loss. But the real question begins here. How did Ukraine lure this massive air force into a trap? On the morning of August 4th, the skies over Crimea once again echoed with Ukraine's unmanned aerial attacks. However, this time, what happened was far beyond the ordinary. This was not a reconnaissance patrol. It was a targeted, meticulously planned raid designed to paralyze a major airbase. The target was the Saki airbase, one of Russia's largest and most well-equipped air bases in Crimea. This base was crucial for maintaining air superiority over the Black Sea, launching airstrikes on southern Ukrainian cities like Kherson and Mykolaiv, and serving as the heart of Russian aviation operations in the region. The 43rd Separate Naval Assault Aviation Regiment, stationed at the base, played a key role in military operations in the region. Every day, Su-30 SM fighter jets took off from here. Su-24 bomber jets changed course to conduct penetration flights, and ground radars were fed with false targets. But on August 4th, this routine was disrupted. The Special Operations Center, affiliated with the Ukrainian Security Service, launched the attack on this strategic location following months of reconnaissance, frequency monitoring, and airflow analysis. First, numerous long-range UAVs with low radar signatures surrounded the Saki base. Some UAVs used false routes to create radar jamming, while the main wave targeted launch pads, aircraft parking areas, and ammunition depots directly. According to hit records, one Su-30 SM fighter jet was completely destroyed. Another Su-30 SM sustained severe damage. 3 Su-24 bomber aircraft were rendered inoperable. The main ammunition depot caught fire. Explosions continued for hours. The type of UAVs used by Ukraine in this attack has not been officially disclosed. However, based on technical data, it is estimated that these vehicles are equipped with high-resolution electro-optical targeting systems and special guidance software resistant to GNSS jamming. Additionally, the fact that the attack vectors came from different directions within the same time window indicates that coordination was carried out through an AI-supported network. Why Saki? Saki Air Base is not just a runway for aircraft. It also serves as the control center for air reconnaissance missions in the Black Sea, the central hub for electronic warfare systems, and a key logistics supply chain node for air defense batteries across Crimea. Even a temporary shutdown of this base would mean a significant weakening of Russian air presence in the northwestern part of the Black Sea. The Su-30 SM, in particular, is the backbone of the Russian Air Force's multi-role mission load. Moscow developed this aircraft as a response to NATO's F-15. It is twin-engine, multi-role, and long-range. It can strike both air and ground targets, refuel in mid-air, guide strategic bombers, and serve as a flying command center when necessary. Su-24s are primarily used for low-altitude bombing and can carry heavy munitions such as the Kh-29, Kh-58. On paper, it was invincible, but on the runway, it wasn't. The Su-30 SM's mission was to detect the enemy from a distance and eliminate it. The possibility of being left defenseless on the battlefield was never considered in the design of this platform. The destruction of these aircraft deals a blow to Russia's ability to attack long-range targets. Moreover, the average cost of a Su-30 SM fighter jet is approximately $50 million. This figure is not merely the sticker price of an aircraft, it represents the concrete value of Russia's extremely limited resources, engineering capabilities, and time. Producing a fighter jet of this caliber is not just a matter of money, it requires modern electronic avionics, advanced radar systems, engine components, testing infrastructure, and highly skilled labor. However, Russia is currently facing serious bottlenecks in almost all of these areas. Western sanctions have brought the supply of microchips and advanced composite materials to a virtual standstill. The Russian defense industry is forced to turn to secondary parts from China or lower-quality alternatives from the domestic market. This is both slowing down the production process and lowering quality. Moreover, the constant spending pressure caused by the war has disrupted budget planning. The Kremlin had increased the defense budget to $150 billion for 2024, but was forced to reduce it to $100 billion for 2025. This decline weakens the ability to establish new production lines and disrupts the maintenance and repair cycles of existing lines. Immediately after the attack, Russia tried to downplay the scale of the incident. However, the fires were clearly visible in satellite data published by NASA's FIRMS system. Leaked civilian videos showed flames reaching nearly to the runway boundaries. The immediate closure of the Kerch Bridge to traffic, along with air defense alerts in Feodosia and Simferopol, highlighted the scale of the panic. Traffic on the Crimean Bridge came to a complete standstill. The queue of vehicles stretching toward the Taman Peninsula reached a record density of over 30 kilometers. Drivers were unable to move for hours. According to a statement from the bridge's press service, around 2 a.m., 1,850 vehicles attempting to enter the bridge from the Taman side were in line for manual security checks. The waiting time reached up to 5 hours. At the same time, 349 more vehicles arriving from the Kerch direction were waiting for security checks. The process on this route was faster, taking approximately 1 hour to complete. However, scanner checks took up to 7 hours in some cases. By 4 p.m., the congestion had decreased slightly. The number of vehicles in the queue dropped to 1,400, and the waiting time fell to 4 hours. Nevertheless, traffic flow in the area has almost completely come to a standstill. Authorities have stated that the delays in scanning are due to increased security concerns. In particular, Ukraine's long-range drone attacks in recent days have prompted Russia to tighten manual checks at critical infrastructure points. The Crimean Bridge is one of the places where these measures are most severely felt. The psychological repercussions of this demonstration are the other side of the coin. The latest call by Refat Chubarov, chairman of the Crimean Tatar National Assembly, clearly reveals this psychological breakdown. Chubarov said that civilians who came from Russia and settled in Crimea illegally must leave the peninsula immediately, and he recorded his message in Russian to directly target the occupiers.
Специально записываю обращение на русском языке, чтобы сказанное мною было понятным гражданам России, которые незаконно пребывают на...
In his statement, Chubarov said, "As you have already begun to realize, the Kerch Bridge, which was illegally built to connect occupied Crimea to Russian territory, will soon be destroyed. And you may find yourselves trapped in a kind of pocket, addressing a broad audience, including Russian citizens vacationing in Crimea, and reinforcing his call for withdrawal. We are seeing these calls yield concrete results." In April 2025, the governor of Sevastopol called for the voluntary evacuation of families with children, followed the next week by the return of railway cars from Donetsk, loaded with passengers via Kerch to Krasnodar, and posts on Russian defense blogs stating that officers' families were being relocated to Novorossiysk, raising alarm bells. News reports indicate that many military families are returning to the Russian mainland in secret or in stages. As is well known, after the 2014 annexation, Russia began encouraging tens of thousands of Russian citizens to settle on the peninsula. The aim was to turn Crimea into Russian territory and change the demographic structure in its favor. According to Russia's official 2014 Crimea census results, the total population of the peninsula was reported as 2.28 million. In this census, the Russian population accounted for 67.9%, Ukrainians for 15.7%, and Crimean Tatars for 10.6%. The ethnic Russian population has risen to 1.5 million since 2014 due to migration and the arrival of military personnel and their families. However, with the war in Ukraine, the situation has changed, especially for Russian officers and their families. The families of Russian military personnel stationed in Crimea are concerned that Crimea may be targeted in a Ukrainian counteroffensive. The Ukrainian partisan movement Atesh made important assessments on this issue. Atesh reported that almost all of the families of senior personnel of the Black Sea Fleet had left the peninsula. The movement attributes this to an internal directive ordering Russian forces to take higher security measures at military facilities in Crimea. According to a report by German broadcaster Deutsche Welle, citing diplomatic sources, Moscow has introduced a priority quota system for the families of security personnel stationed in Crimea. Initially, around 10,000 people were targeted for relocation to Krasnodar and Stavropol. The partisan network reported that Bar's reserve units were conducting secret patrols in civilian clothing in the bays of Sevastopol, that security measures had been increased, and that equipment was being concealed. Additionally, all leave days for military personnel have been cancelled, according to a statement by an ATESH agent directly linked to air defense systems. Air defense personnel have begun evacuating their families to military camps in the southern military district. This evacuation order can be seen as a sign that the security situation in the region is critical. It is alleged that the Russian administration plans to evacuate approximately 250,000 people in the first phase, including military families, defense industry technicians, railway and port personnel, children, and the elderly. According to an analysis published by Forbes Russia, the Black Sea Fleet headquarters has 30,000 family members, half of whom have already left between May and July 2025. In addition to military personnel, ordinary Russians on the peninsula are also leaving Crimea. Reports indicate that the number of Russian citizens leaving the peninsula has reached 100,000 in recent times. This number is expected to increase further in light of recent developments. The total daily capacity for two-way traffic is 40,000 vehicles, but following the explosions in 2024, traffic on the sole remaining bridge has been reduced by half. The same situation is ongoing today. However, traffic on the peninsula remains gridlocked. The Kerch Bridge is also a risky alternative for those seeking to flee Crimea. This is because the bridge falls within the range of Storm Shadow and Attack-MS missiles. Ukraine stated in May 2025 that it is maintaining its strike and retreat capability targeting Kerch. The railway section is still limited by repairs. It has been reduced to 2 trains per hour, or 4,000 passengers. In other words, all exits from the peninsula are about to close. Novorossiysk was considered a route. 50% of the Black Sea Fleet is stationed here. The fleet can carry 1,000 passengers chance landing operations with Rapacha-class landing ships, but a significant portion of the ships have been hit or are under repair. The straits are closed to warships under the Montreux Convention, but civilian ro-ro services are theoretically possible with Turkey's permission. Large passenger flights are unsafe due to the threat of UAVs and cruise missiles. There have been no scheduled flights since the summer of 2024. IL-76 sorties are being used for military strategic transport. Civilian ship passage in the Black Sea is free under the Montreux Convention, but Turkey invoked Article 19 3 days after the start of the war in March 2022, restricting the straits to the warring parties. Therefore, Russian naval assets cannot enter the area. However, Russian civilian ferries can transit from the Caucasus coast to the waters off Odessa without stopping. Turkey does not provide military escort to evacuation ships caught in the actual conflict, but can provide a pre-authorized corridor through the straits for humanitarian convoys flying the SAF-EAID/ICRC flag. Considering all this information, the evacuation of all Russians in Crimea appears to be quite challenging. In conclusion, Ukraine's latest drone attack not only eliminated a military target, but also once again declared to the world that the nature of war has changed. In the battlefield, it is no longer expensive technology that prevails, but accessible intelligence. Drones costing a few $1,000s are rendering jets, radar facilities, and ammunition depots worth millions of dollars useless in a matter of seconds. This was more than just an attack. This was asymmetric warfare itself. Ukraine is now openly challenging Russia's military infrastructure, built over decades and costing billions of dollars, with a drone worth a few months' salary. These UAVs, which cost less than a family car, can take out an entire airbase. Russia's high-tech platforms like the Su-30SM were designed for modern air combat, but when parked, they are as defenseless as a bird. This is where Ukraine's advantage lies. This is not a land grab. The issue now is doctrine, superiority, and who will define the logic of future warfare. Every jet shot down is not just a combat vehicle. It is a blow to the Kremlin's belief that it is superior in war. Every depot that burns is not just a loss of ammunition, it is a crack in the invulnerability armor that Putin's regime has presented to the public. And this is not only on the front lines, it is also creating chaos in the subconscious of the Russian people. For civilians living in semi-isolated but strategically important regions like Crimea, these attacks mean that areas once considered safe are now targets. Ukraine is no longer a passive defender, it is an active and planned threat. This new strategy, which achieves greater impact at lower cost, proves that war is won not just with weapons, but with time, resources, and psychology. At this point, Kiev has struck not only a Su-30SM, but also Russia's perception of superiority in the war. The outcome is clear. Ukraine is determined, its strategy is sharp, and the message is clear: Crimea is Ukraine. Thank you for watching. What moves could Russia make in response to the bridge's destruction? One of the most likely options is to disable the Patriot batteries in Ukraine. To do this, Moscow theoretically has Kh-59 air-to-surface missiles at its disposal. But in practice, things are not so simple. The US-Norwegian-made Nemesis electronic warfare system, deployed west of Kharkiv, confuses guided missiles such as the Kh-59 with GPS jamming signals it spreads across the field. These missiles need American satellite data to find their targets. But Nemesis distorts directional information, so the missiles often veer off into empty fields or are shot down before they can turn back. This means that the first option is systematically doomed to failure. The second option is to launch a salvo of Caliber NK missiles from the Black Sea Fleet at the Odessa-Belgorod-Dnistrovsky line. The aim here is not a direct hit, but to put pressure on the Patriot system's radar and optical sensors. The missile threat would jam the radars and slow down the defense response. But this also looks stronger on paper. This is because Caliber missiles are already assigned to more priority defense areas such as the Kerch Bridge, Novorossiysk, and Volgograd. Each Caliber missile is expensive and there are few of them. Therefore, rather than spending its Caliber stockpile to gain limited psychological superiority, the Kremlin is focused on shaping its defense against the JDAM-ER threat. Because what they have realized is that an American bomb can cause much more damage than a missile range test from the Soviet era. The Ukrainian side is preparing for the second phase immediately after the first strike. The number of MiG-29s carrying JDAM-ER munitions has now exceeded 18. Thanks to newly developed wing pylon adapters, each aircraft can carry 2 GBU-62 bombs in a single sortie. This creates an operational multiplier effect, more destruction with fewer flights. The target list has already been finalized. One option is the suspension towers of the Kerch Bridge. The other is the Mariupol railway viaduct. Both are of both symbolic and strategic importance. When the munitions payload reaches 2,000 pounds, the destruction threshold for such fixed structures is easily surpassed. Western experts are quite clear about this attack concept. This package, whether it's a radar tower or a bridge pier within range, will hit its target with pinpoint accuracy when the right coordination is in place. Ukraine, meanwhile, is preparing to use this precision to systematically dismantle Russia's logistics and transportation infrastructure. More interestingly, the question arises whether new JDAM-ERs will replace the existing stock. The Pentagon has committed to delivering an additional 900 units to Ukraine by the end of 2025. This means that Kiev now has not just a few munitions at its disposal, but the capacity to carry out a planned campaign. The calculation on the strategic table is as follows. If we strike one bridge per week, Kerch will be under psychological siege before summer ends. The targets on the map have already been marked. Alternative routes for armored convoys have been nearly eliminated. Russia's asphalt and railway network is being cornered further with each strike. On the countermeasure front, there is a plan being carried out in a hurry. Su-30 SM fighter jets are being integrated with Irkutsk-made Kibini-U electronic jammers. But there is a serious problem here. The software is not ready. The target date for the updated jammer software to be put into active service is the end of the year. Until then, the Russian military's fuel and ammunition transportation will have to race against the clock and navigate every millimeter like a minefield through the sunken passages of the Dnipro. The most notable balancing factor in Ukraine's latest bridge destruction attack is the new core structure of its air defense system, Patriot batteries. The US has quietly increased Ukraine's Patriot capacity to 3 batteries through shipments from Poland's Rzeszów Air Logistics Hub. 2 of these are the latest PAK-3 MSE variant, while the third is the GEM-T, which provides broader coverage. This combination provides not only point defense, but also sufficient range for regional threat suppression. Positioned to protect the Zaporizhzhia front, these systems create an electronic umbrella that provides maneuvering space for the Ukrainian Air Force. When MiG-29s carrying JDAM-ER take off from this Patriot coverage area and launch their munitions, an interesting tactical chain begins. The Russian side, seeking to intercept the launched JDAM, is forced to fire S-300/400 series SAM systems as a countermeasure. But the radar emissions and launch fire from these systems are directly visible on the Patriot radar image. When the S-400 comes into play, US-made PAC-3 missiles can instantly detect these threats. This tactic is known in military literature as forcing a stalemate. Ukraine is forcing Russian air defenses to make a decision. Either fire the missile and risk being destroyed by the Patriot MSE, or remain silent and watch the strategic bridge collapse. The S-400 battery did not fire in this attack because if it had, it would have faced the risk of an out-of-range intercept, i.e. missile loss or a Patriot counterattack. Result, the bridge collapsed. This is a new nightmare for the Kremlin. Now it's not just about focusing on the target, they must also calculate the risk of exposing their systems, missile waste, and radar positions with every shot. Don't be surprised if new JDAMER images appear on your screens in the coming days, because every explosion destroys not just a target, but also a supply network that has been woven over weeks. Sometimes destroying a bridge is enough to immobilize an entire brigade. The Karachakrak Pass was precisely that breaking point. How do you think Moscow will compensate for this blow? Will it open a new transit route, bring its air defense forward, or pursue a completely different strategy? We look forward to your comments below. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications, because in this war, a single GPS coordinate can change the fate of an entire front. Thank you for watching. A Mykolaiv-based naval intelligence unit reports that the attack directly affected stocks of JP-5 high-density jet fuel needed to fire Caliber cruise missiles from Karakurt-class corvettes. These corvettes form the backbone of Russia's strategic deterrence in the Black Sea. However, such disruptions in the fuel supply chain not only slow down their operational tempo, but also limit their missile strike capabilities. Furthermore, if the fuel terminal in Sochi remains out of commission for an extended period, the Russian Navy will have to redirect its JP-5 refueling operations to Novorossiysk. This is not merely a physical change of direction, it adds an additional 170 kilometers to the supply chain. Land-based refueling reaching sea-based fuel platforms via this new route requires both more time and additional security units. When evaluated based on technological parameters, the Lyuty-Boba architecture calls into question the sustainability of the Russian defense system, not only due to its kinetic impact on the battlefield, but also due to the disruption it causes to budget schedules. The core strength of this system does not lie in its radar visibility, but in its stealth capabilities. The carbon and Kevlar-based composite body reduces the RCS value to below 0.005 square meters. This places it in the category of targets that remain undetectable by most short-range radars. There is no reliance on classic GNSS-based navigation. Thanks to convolutional neural network-supported optical matching trained with low-resolution maps and integrated IMU sensors, the Lyuty-Boba can reach its target with a CEP of 8 to 12 meters, even under GPS GLO blackouts. Moreover, these flights are conducted in RS silent mode, leaving no electromagnetic signature detectable by Russian electronic warfare systems. Looking at the hardware side, the picture is even more striking. The flight control board consists of an inexpensive PCB imported from Taiwan, soldered with an ARM Cortex-M4 microcontroller. The camera module is an 8 MB CMOS sensor produced for the Chinese market, including labor and mold expenses, does not exceed $25,000. Meanwhile, the cost of repairing and reactivating just 2 transformer stations in Kotelnikovo and Salsk, according to the Regional Energy Authority, amounted to $31 million. This translates to a devastating cost-effectiveness ratio of 1 to 124. In other words, Kiev can neutralize $124 million worth of fixed infrastructure with every $1 million spent on drone stockpiles. This is why the Kremlin has shifted its defense strategy toward protecting infrastructure. The concrete hangar project comes into play precisely at this point. High-ceilinged, impact-resistant, RF-shielded reinforced concrete structures are being built at railway junctions such as Volgograd, Bryansk, and Rostov to minimize the impact of UAVs. However, this solution, which looks promising on paper, faces 3 major obstacles in the field. First, concrete domes reduce access for overhead crane systems, slowing down the loading-unloading cycle per station by 140%. Second, these structures cause dangerous gas buildup in the summer due to ventilation deficiencies. The risk of explosion increases, especially in gasoline and diesel tanks, due to vaporization. Third, and most importantly, the construction process. A typical hangar takes 330 days to build. This allows Kiev to produce more than 700 Lyuty-Boba during the same period. The financial picture is even bleaker. The Russian Ministry of Economy's budget revision report, submitted to the Duma in May 2025, forecasts a 42% increase in spending on rail defense in rubles. However, during the same period, the ruble lost 4.3% against the dollar due to panic selling that began after the Sochi refinery was hit. While concrete plans are being made, foreign exchange reserves are dwindling. The current expression, used sarcastically in Moscow, is, "The wall cracked before it was built." A security fantasy, plastered with fragile rubles rather than concrete, clearly reveals that the Kremlin's defense reflexes are constrained by economic rather than technical limits. The ruble crisis on the economic front has landed on the Kremlin's desk as the financial echo of the gradually spreading railway sabotage. By the end of July, the Russian Ministry of Finance was forced to increase the budget item under the heading of National Internal Security by 500 billion rubles. This represents a deviation of 23% from the target set at the beginning of the year. However, the bill did not remain on paper. The ruble fell to 83.5 2 days after the Sochi explosion and tested the 85 mark after the Volgograd fire. This was a psychological breaking point in the foreign exchange markets. The central bank hit the brakes. The ruble was propped up with a 500 basis point interest rate hike. However, this intervention triggered another crisis in terms of the defense economy balance. Commercial interest rates skyrocketed to 21.5%. This increase directly hit not only large holding companies, but also small and medium-sized enterprises, which are the real backbone of Russia's industrial chain. Thousands of local producers supplying bolts, fuel filters, pressure valves, or PTFE hoses to the defense industry complex can no longer access short-term credit. This is because the ruble has created an inflationary environment that is eroding working capital on a nearly weekly basis. As the fragile components of the military supply chain struggle to access financing, production has begun to slow down. A Kaluga workshop supplying air valves to a defense factory in Rostov has postponed its order schedule by 2 weeks due to an inability to secure a letter of guarantee. This domino effect signifies not only a production slowdown, but also a permanent investment erosion in Russia's domestic defense capabilities. In this entire scenario, the most critical gain for the Ukrainian side is psychological. The Kremlin's 20-year narrative about the invincibility and stability of its deep internal lines has been shattered by the orange smoke billowing from the Volgograd station. The internal front rhetoric is now the subject of mockery on Russian social media. Under the hashtag Narodny Corridor, young people are sharing photos of train tickets with fire emojis added via Photoshop. Though it may seem like a minor military detail, for the first time since 2022, a significant portion of the Russian population outside Moscow is actually feeling the logistical strain of war. In summary, fuel is burning in tanks, rails are intact but bridges are destroyed. Money is melting away in an unprotected budget, but asymmetric intelligence does not melt. Every time the polymer body of the Lyuty boba cools down, a new orange mushroom cloud rises above another station. No matter what concrete dome the Kremlin uses to cover the supply chain, the fire of $25,000 drones will continue to empty the iron grids. Because this war is no longer fought only in trenches, but in signal boxes, transformer squares, and the fine dust of rail tracks illuminated at dawn. And the pen writing that story flies on small but deadly wings guided by a calculated mind. Thank you for watching. The Russian army spent months laying mines and traps in critical areas and passageways. But Ukraine used unimaginable tactics to blow Putin's traps up in his face. Using the enemy's traps against them required great coordination, intelligence, and tactical awareness. In this context, on August 2nd, Ukrainian forces carried out a demolition operation that looked like something out of a military thriller. The incident was highly dramatic for the Russian army. This is because the Russians had placed TM-62 anti-tank mines on the bridge over the Tartar River. They had prepared to blow up the bridge in the event of a Ukrainian attack in the Bryansk region. They hung nets and set traps to protect the bridge. And in the event of a possible Ukrainian ambush, the Russians would press the button as Ukrainian troops crossed the bridge. But moments later, a Ukrainian FPV drone pilot, using a fiber optic connection, skillfully overcame all obstacles, accurately hit the Russian mines, and blew up the bridge. The strike asset selected for the bridge in Bryansk was a carbon fiber-bodied, FPV-controlled 3 to 4 kilograms class kamikaze drone. The 400 to 500 grams of explosive material placed in the front section of the body was insufficient to detonate directly. Nearly 30 TM62 anti-tank mines were placed under the bridge to block Ukrainian advances. These Soviet-made mines, with steel bodies carrying 7 to 8 kilograms of TNT, had the power to shatter a tank's underside. Under normal circumstances, these mines would be activated either by a mechanical trigger system or by remote detonation. But this time, Ukraine started the chain reaction. However, when it struck with precision, it was powerful enough to create a shockwave that would trigger one of the TM62 anti-tank mines inside the steel console holding the bridge. The TM62 contains 7 to 8 kilograms of TNT in its body, and the pressure exerted on its fusion element triggers the mine. The chain reaction anticipated by the Ukrainian planners began precisely here. When a single mine detonated, all the other mines embedded in the bridge's structure exploded one after another. In total, an energy equivalent to nearly 250 kilograms of TNT was released. The concrete pavement layer, along with the steel beams, was lifted several meters into the air before shattering and scattering into the Tsata River and its surroundings. According to eyewitness accounts, an area with a radius of 100 meters was nearly completely transformed into craters and debris after the explosion. In footage shared on social media, the FPV drone can be clearly seen gliding at low altitude, then locking onto its target and colliding with its support leg, followed by the start of a destructive chain reaction explosion a few seconds later. With the explosion, the drone camera goes dark, and then a column of flames rising into the sky is reflected in the camera. As a thick layer of smoke rises in the area, only charred metal pieces and blackened concrete blocks remain of the bridge. With the collapse of the bridge, evacuation and support links for Russian troops stationed along a 16-kilometer border strip have been completely cut. The explosion destroyed not only a passageway, but also Russia's confidence in its border defense line. But don't think that an ordinary target was destroyed. This was a Russian defense hub that had been carefully prepared not only from an engineering standpoint, but also on a tactical level. The basis of this operation is Ukraine's drone doctrine, which has been maturing in the field. Kiev has abandoned its Soviet-era heavy industry-based defense concept and perfected the low-cost, high-impact formula with cheap, agile, and smart platforms. According to OSINT sources close to the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense, the troops serving in this region are currently effectively trapped behind Ukraine's front lines. So why did Russia set such a trap for itself? The reflex to protect the border was based on the buffer corridor doctrine, officially announced by Moscow in the fall of 2023. Under this doctrine, a series of fixed defense lines were built along the Bryansk, Belgorod, and Kursk regions. The main goal was to stop possible Ukrainian ground attacks before they reached the border and to create a defensive depth within Russian territory. To this end, anti-tank trenches were dug for miles, minefields were laid, concrete blocks were used to create barriers, and remote-controlled explosive devices were placed under strategic bridges. But this defensive architecture also had a weakness. The geographical structure of the region was extremely limited in terms of alternative passages and logistical flexibility. Concrete bridges built over natural obstacles, such as the Tsata River, served not only a tactical, but also a strategic lifeline function. These bridges were indispensable, not only for the passage of military convoys, but also for the advance of armored units, the transport of ammunition and fuel, evacuation routes, and even basic lines to rear logistics centers. The bridge over the Tsata was an absolute choke point due to the inadequacy of the surrounding infrastructure. The dirt roads to the south were muddy during the summer months due to sudden rains, making it impossible for heavy transport vehicles to pass. The forest cover to the north consisted of narrow, sloping slopes, unsuitable for armored vehicles. Therefore, the destruction of the Tsata Bridge eliminated not only a transport line, but also the main supply and evacuation corridor for all Russian forces in the region. How Ukraine achieved this cannot be explained by simply flying a drone. First came the intelligence step. Both satellite imagery and frontline intelligence sources were used to map the mine configuration in the area. Civilian-looking, fixed-wing surveillance drones recorded military traffic between the bridge's entrance and exit for a week. Video analytics revealed the times when fuel tankers and armored personnel carriers passed through. Heat map analysis identified the traces of excavation activities carried out by Russian excavators at the bridge's foundation, which helped determine the timing of mine laying. Signal intelligence then came into play, since Russian engineering units used low-power RF firing modules to remotely trigger TM62 mines. Electromagnetic interference patterns were observed in the area. Interference windows confirmed the geographical distribution of the mine array. The final attack plan was drawn up, assuming that there were 3 main drive points on the northwestern leg of the bridge and 1 on the southeastern leg. The target was the corner leg, where at least 2 mines would trigger each other. The FPV drone, equipped with a limited explosive charge, locked onto this leg. The drone's final maneuver, lasting 10 seconds, was designed to move parallel to the ground and then suddenly climb upward, causing the body to strike the underside of the bridge girder. One important detail to note is that the bridge has been designated a red zone by Russian troops since the first year of the war. There are unmanned surveillance towers and thermal cameras, but most of the night vision algorithms are focused on tracking trucks and vehicles that give off high heat signatures. With its composite carbon body, electric motor, and minimal IR signature, the FPV drone was almost impossible to detect on Russian surveillance screens. When the flight speed reached 120 kilometers an hour, the detection window dropped to 2 or 3 seconds. A very short window for a human operator to react, activate an RF jammer, or relay orders to a drone defense artillery unit. When considering why Russia couldn't prevent this, 3 answers emerge. First, the mine network laid under the bridge falls under the passive defense category. While the mine is under the bridge, the RF trigger cannot be jammed with interference because the activation sensor is triggered by mechanical vibration when the drone collides with it. Second, Russian electronic warfare capabilities were weak near the bridge. EW teams were deployed deeper into the front lines to protect critical radar domes in Belgorod and Kursk. This rural area of Bryansk was primarily a transit point for ground convoys. Air defense was a low priority. Third, the Russian army adopted a modular corridor approach instead of a comprehensive surveillance network, so sensor data does not flow to a simultaneous command center. Each bridge is under the responsibility of a separate unit. Different regiments carry different EW codes. In such fragmented networks, opening a window for rapid reaction is nearly impossible. Looking at the impact of the attack on the front lines, logistical delays are already being felt. Russia was moving an average of 300 tons of fuel and ammunition per day through Bryansk before the bridge was destroyed. In the first 48 hours after the explosion, shipments fell to almost 0. Alternative routes offer 2 different bypasses, via Klintsy in the north and around Starodub in the south. But both routes are longer and have been marked as sensitive areas since previous Ukrainian drone attacks. The first figures included in ISW's daily Frontline report indicate that approximately 5 Russian units have shifted positions along the Bryansk border under the pretext of a tactical withdrawal. In reality, this is not a withdrawal, but an inability to hold positions due to supply shortages. If the fuel convoy cannot arrive, the 6 soldiers inside the BMP-3 cannot maintain the fire support line. When ammunition trucks are delayed, it becomes impossible to defend 122mm artillery positions with AK-74 rifle fire. The psychological impact is even more intense. Russia frequently uses the concept of a deep rear in its propaganda. Regions close to Moscow, key bridges behind the front lines, and major railway junctions are claimed to be under absolute protection, out of reach of Ukrainian drones. The destruction of bridges has undermined this claim. Images shared on Russian social media by relatives of soldiers show not only bridge debris but also armored convoys diverted onto side roads. The question, "Why are our mines exploding on us?" has been trending on social media. The economic impact extends beyond Bryansk. The bridges in the border region are the arteries of the north-south logistics axis stretching from the Caucasus to St. Petersburg. When this route is cut off, additional strain is placed on railway traffic between Rostov and Donbass. Railway transportation accounts for 70% of Russia's total military logistics. The destruction of a bridge may seem like a minor setback at the macro level, but if we consider the series of events that took place at the same time, with oil depots burning in Sochi, a tanker station being hit in Volgograd, and a fuel train exploding on the Rostov-Salsk line, the cost multiplier grows. While the cost per UAV ranges from $5,000 to $25,000, repairing a concrete bridge can cost $4 million to $5 million. When multiplied by fuel supply delays and armored repair bills, the damage adds up to a staggering figure. The attack also stands out as a textbook example of Kiev's deep strike logistics disruption strategy. This strategy is based on a three-tiered attack architecture. The first layer consists of low-cost but high-impact continuous drone attacks. FPV and fixed-wing kamikaze UAVs are sent in waves to targets behind the front lines. These attacks are often carried out with decoy UAVs to confuse air defenses and force them to overreact. As a result, the Russian defense system becomes unable to distinguish which threats are real. The second layer is the precision strike phase, where high-precision guided munitions come into play. Western systems such as JDAM-ER, Storm Shadow, and Scalp-EG target critical infrastructure such as radar towers, fuel tanks, bridges, and command centers. The third layer consists of electronic warfare-supported signal jamming operations. Jamming systems such as Nemesis, Bukovel, and Thor in Ukraine's infantry blind the radars of Russian surface-to-air missile batteries, facilitating the previous two layers' targets. This three-tiered structure was applied exactly in the attack on the bridge over the Tsata River in Bryansk. Electronic warfare assets near the Ukrainian border prevented Russian EW units from tracking the drone's routes and taking countermeasures. The FPV drone then targeted Russian anti-tank mines placed directly on the bridge's support columns. The force of the explosion came from both the munitions and the chain reaction. The invisible aspect of the operation is the drone technology itself. Several Ukrainian startup companies have produced semi-artificial intelligence control software for FPV drones. The operator manually flies the drone until the final approach. In the last 15 meters, the internal LiDAR and optical matching systems kick in. The artificial neural network identifies the weakest point of the bridge's structure and sends a confirmation signal to the pilot. This minimizes factors such as signal delay and wind drift. No matter how small the target, the drone hits its final point, known as the laser, with millimeter precision. In Russian defense doctrine, countering this is only possible with hard-kill cannons or high-energy lasers. However, Russia's Pantsir S-1 batteries experience delays when firing 30mm cannon shells even if they detect a 1kg FPV drone, and if the detection-to-fire window is less than 2 seconds, the artillery response cannot keep up. High-energy lasers are still in the prototype stage. This technological asymmetry is directly reflected in Putin's image. The most critical component of the military modernization narrative that the Kremlin has been building for years is air defense. Platforms such as the S-400 Triumph, Pantsir, Tor M2 and Baikal radar were lined up like decorations in parades. Now, images of FPV drones costing a few $1,000s slipping through the S-400's blind spot and disrupting Russia's own mine system are undermining the triumph narrative on the ground. What is devastating for the Russian public is not so much the magnitude of the loss as the fact that the trap has backfired on its creator. The long-term equation that will result from the bridge destruction may force Russia to question its mine trench defense doctrine. When combined with the bridge, the mine protecting the shelter becomes a potential bomb ready to explode. Moscow will either reduce the number of mines. This will open the way for Ukrainian ground forces, or else a bridge system with more steel-plated mines will be needed, which will increase costs and extend construction time. The rule of military engineering that protection, if it lacks flexibility, backfires, is being added as a footnote to Russia's Bryansk lesson. Finally, we must address Putin's political image. A regime that bases its legitimacy on the strategic control myth must rewrite its narrative when it loses a bridge due to its own mine plan. Let's end with a pertinent question. If the Kremlin's mine explodes on the border bridge, who will defend the watchtowers in Moscow? Public perception is embracing the narrative of disaster rather than explaining the failure. Russian history is familiar with the smell of gunpowder from military mistakes, from the Afghanistan trauma to the Chechnya fiasco. But this time, the mistake is not exploding on the front lines, but in the backyard. The smell of gunpowder at home is too strong to be suppressed by any propaganda. The destroyed bridge in Bryansk is not just a pile of concrete and steel. It is a living monument to the defeat of a costly legacy of defense by a wave of cheap and clever attacks in the old-new war equation. Ukraine made Russia pay for this with an FPV drone. Russia fell into the trap it had set by laying mines. The war will continue, but now everyone knows that the side that can bomb the red lines on the map, not on the battlefield, will win the game. Thank you for watching. Putin is in panic mode because a single move by Sweden and the US is undermining Russia's latest plans on both the Baltic and Ukrainian fronts. Russian warplanes were doing whatever they wanted in areas they considered their safe haven in the Baltic, and Russia was trying to pressure the West with its massive drone pressure in Ukraine. But everything changed dramatically in an instant. Here's how. At the end of July, Stockholm announced that it would integrate the latest variant of the AIM-120, the C-8, worth $3.5 billion, into its Gripen fleet, and at the same time accelerate the program to transfer hundreds of RB-99s, the old AIM-120Bs, that had been waiting in hangars for years to Ukraine. So, how might Russia be affected by these developments, with Sweden turning the Baltic sky into Ukraine's air defense shield? Sweden's AIM-120 C-8 modernization may appear to be a technical upgrade that fundamentally disrupts the Baltic air balance, but there is a multi-layered strategic plan behind it. The new C-8 variant provides approximately 40 kilometers of additional range compared to its predecessor, the C-7, and almost entirely covers the launch and escape zone that Russian Su-30/35 fleets have considered safe when departing from Kaliningrad. For example, the distance from the eastern coast of the Baltic to Stockholm is 430 kilometers, and from Gotland to St. Petersburg is 320 kilometers. A Gripen carrying C-8, with its low-altitude climb profile, can patrol right in the center of this corridor without refueling. Russian pilots now begin receiving high-probability engagement warnings in the cockpit before even approaching firing range. This not only increases the likelihood of aircraft loss, but also accelerates the rate at which expensive Kinzhal or Kh-31 cruise missiles are expended. For Moscow, with limited munition stocks, this makes the dilemma of going deep or launching from a distance and retreating quickly even more costly with each sortie. The second critical factor, as important as technical power, is electronic warfare immunity. The C-8's digital guidance unit neutralizes the noise cloud techniques created by Kibini IJ jamming pods, thanks to its mixed waveform and steerable antenna scanning pattern. Target updates are transmitted every second of flight via the Gripen's Link 22 data link to the Eri-I AEW&C radar, NATO's common air picture, and the sensor fusion of Patriot PAC-3 batteries. Russian ECM pods are few in number, maintenance-intensive, and already operating at limited capacity. As a result, their operational rhythm breaks down when forced into narrowband jamming. The passive scanner modules of Sweden's Coast Guard radars, which will be modernized in 2024, also increase the signal consistency of this network. Even after a missile is launched, the tracking and illumination signal is not interrupted, and Russian pilots lose the comfort of fire and forget. The Gripen concept's road-to-air tactic directly exploits the logistical weaknesses of the Russian aerospace forces. Thanks to the standard 6-minute takeoff and 12-minute rearming times achieved by Saab engineers on a 400-meter asphalt strip, more than 20 temporary runways in Finland and Sweden can be randomly activated, leaving the Russian A-50U early warning axis in a complex and unpredictable missile trap. The already limited number of A-50U platforms have neither the personnel nor the spare parts chain to maintain a 24-hour watch in the Western Baltic. The geographical circle is also narrowing. As Finland prepares its F-35 squadrons for deployment, the island of Gotland is closing off the low-altitude shadow corridor favored by Russian Su-34s using the Eri-I radar flying sentinel concept. Transporting new S-400 batteries to Kaliningrad is bringing Moscow into a high-cost, low-sustainability spiral due to the logistical risk of HMR's ER range, the defensive vulnerability of the Suwalki corridor, and rising foreign exchange costs. Long-range R-37M or K-77M stocks are currently prioritized for the Ukrainian front. Any missile production plans to be shifted to the Baltic will be postponed, increasing the unit cost by 18% annually due to the volatility of the ruble-yuan exchange rate. But Stockholm's agenda does not stop there. The second pillar of the strategy involves transferring RB-99 AIM-120B stockpiles to Ukraine. In accordance with the third-party transfer provisions of the Pentagon's July 31st document, hundreds of RB-99 Raytheons rusting in Swedish hangars are entering the revision line and being made compatible with NASAM's Block 2 launchers. Russia was facing an increasingly dire situation in Ukraine. The Russian army reached a deadlock in its ground operations. It also failed to achieve any results at sea. Its only hope was to wear down Ukraine with drone attacks, and it almost succeeded. Russia launched a record 6,400 drones and missiles in July, and Patriot stockpiles were reaching alarm levels. But the Patriots arrived first. Then, with a single agreement, a powerful missile chain exchange from Sweden began. And this is changing the entire war equation. Timing is critical here. This move is being made at a time when Russian airspace violations are increasing along the entire Baltic Black Sea line, and 6,400 drones and missiles have been launched by Russia in Ukraine. It is claimed that in closed briefings by the Ministry of Defense, it was noted that, when the newest missiles arrive, our RB-99 stock will be taken out of active service. The RB-99 is the modernized version of the AIM-120B, which operates under the Swedish code. Although classified as second generation under Western standards, this munition can still pose a significant threat to Shahed-derived drones, Kh-59 cruise missiles, and even low-altitude Su-25 attack aircraft, thanks to its active radar seeker and practical strike radius of approximately 55 kilometers. Sweden's intention to redirect two-thirds of its approximately 1,500 RB-99s to a new ally, namely Ukraine, under a stock transfer protocol, is no longer a secret. The economic equation behind this decision is straightforward. As the C-8s arrive, the RB-99s will remain idle in storage. Their shelf life will shorten, and each maintenance cycle will create chronic budget pressures. At regional cabinet meetings in Oslo, Copenhagen, Vilnius and Riga, the view that it is better to put them to use on the front lines than let them rot on cold shelves was voiced loudly. According to Stockholm's budget briefing, the total amount allocated for C-8 integration is $800 million. Of this, $350 million will be covered by US domestic production subsidies and $200 million by R&D loans from the European Defence Fund. Thus, Sweden will not have to take cash out of its coffers when donating the RB-99s. Accelerated delivery for early transition to modern inventory has also been added to Washington's approval document. Kiev's contribution to this package will be minimal. German and Dutch grant funds will cover a significant portion of the transportation, coding, and adaptation costs. The remainder will be covered by the US's 2025 Sustainment Assistance Program. The picture emerging for Ukraine points to an increasingly tough defense struggle. A total of 6,400 unmanned aerial vehicles and cruise missiles fired by Russia throughout July 2025 were reported by the Ukrainian Military Intelligence Agency as a firing tempo beyond tactical limits. This figure was supported by over 200 Shahed 131/136s, nearly 180 Kh-101 cruise missiles, and more than 50 Caliber missiles in just 1 month. The gaps in Ukraine's air defense map, particularly in the mid-altitude layer, have become much more visible in this new wave of attacks. While Patriot PAC-3 MSE batteries can intercept hypersonic threats at high altitudes, such as the Kinjal and Caliber, the layer transition points between mid- and low-altitude layers remain vulnerable. This is where the strategic value of the RB-99 stockpile becomes clear. Sweden's transfer of these missiles to Ukraine creates an intermediate layer in terms of both platform and range. According to NATO and Saab sources, the RB-99 missiles are configured to be easily integrated with NASAMS or future F-16 fleets. The Ukrainian Air Force's first F-16 fleet, awaiting final combat approval in Romania, is already loaded with AIM-9X Sidewinders. But the real critical threshold is integration with fully compatible variants of the AMRAAM series. Since the RB99 is actually a customized version of the AMRAAM for Sweden, the software protocol is completely identical. Thanks to weapon platform compatibility packages called doc files shared by Saab with Ukrainian engineers, full synchronization can be achieved with only 3,700 lines of source code and 4 in-house test flights. This reduces the software certification process, which normally takes 6 months, to as little as 6 weeks. This means that Ukraine will theoretically be able to launch RB99/AMRAAM variants from F-16 by September 2025. The stock figures are worth mentioning. When 1,000 RB99s are deployed, each F-16 can carry 20 missiles in the medium-altitude defense line stretching from the Black Sea to Poltava. Assuming an 85% hit probability algorithm, this adds the capacity to respond to 200 targets per week with the help of data link assistance from Patriot radar networks. This seemingly technical ratio strikes at the most vulnerable aspect of Russia's swarm drone bombardments: their economic sustainability. The Shahed 136 costs between $15,000 and $20,000 to procure. In Ukraine, an average of 1/3 reach their target, and 2 are shot down. The RB99 may seem expensive at $50,000 per engagement, but when the same target is hit with the Patriot architecture, the bill rises to $3.5 million. Thus, the RB99 takes over the Patriot's role in the mid-altitude window for emergency takeoff and heavy bombardment, reducing missile costs by 98%. This scenario is even more problematic for the Russian side. As the safe passage rate for Shaheds declines, the Kremlin is forced to increase trade-off prices with Iran instead of boosting production. The latest Defense Intelligence Analysis report notes that Russia spent $300 million on Shahed procurement alone in the first half of 2025, subsidized by sales of petrochemical byproducts. The second piece of the defense chain comes from Germany. Berlin has agreed to transfer 2 complete Patriot systems, a combination of 16 launchers and 10 radar command vehicles, to Kyiv under the US-Germany-Ukraine trilateral protocol. These batteries will undergo serial modification at the Yavoriv training ground near the Polish border. The planned deployment will protect the Odessa-Mykolaiv line and the Kharkiv-Dnipro corridor. While the AMRAAM stock will fill the middle layer, the Patriot will strengthen the upper layer's interceptor shield. Although the cost-benefit analysis discussed by the German Interior and Defense Committee raised the objection that the RB99s will run out of range while the Patriots wait in Polish skies, the Federal Chancellery passed the decision, citing the Scandinavian strategic share of the AMRAAM swap. Berlin's calculation is twofold. First, as Ukraine's qualified air defense weakens Russia's motivation to target energy infrastructure, Europe's gas-electricity fluctuations will remain stable. Second, once the Patriot batteries are withdrawn from German territory, modernization will be prioritized with the TLVS/Patriot hybrid system taking their place by 2028. On the technical front, the Gripen C/D fleet is the backbone of the operation. Saab's design, which has been in development for over 30 years, stands out with its ability to take off and land on short runways, low radar cross-section, electronic warfare pods embedded in a composite fuselage, and most importantly, NATO Link 16 data link. It may seem small compared to huge programs such as the F-16 Block 70, which is being discussed for sale to Turkey, or the F-35 ordered by Poland. But in the Baltic theater, being small is an advantage. Gripen's real weapon is its network-centric combat capability. The aircraft's IDAM data link pod can combine what the ground radar cannot see, what a Visby corvette's passive sensor detects, and even the electro-optical fragments collected by a Finnish ground-based passive listening station into a single screen. This network creates a complete kill web matrix for the AMRAAM C8. When the missile is launched, the pilot can turn without having to cut the illumination line to the target, transferring guidance information to a peer aircraft. This multi-pronged system leaves the Kaliningrad-based Su-30 SM pairs with a narrowing maneuvering corridor, because even if they evade radar, another node will detect their signature. When Ukraine's F-16s arrive with Link 16 standard software, this network will extend from the Baltic to the Black Sea. Russia's openly stated counter-reflex is to keep its MiG-31BM interceptors on high alert in the Kaliningrad and Leningrad oblasts, and to shift the patrol route of its A-50U early warning aircraft from the Baltic center to the St. Petersburg coastline. Logistics documents from the Leningrad military district show 3 additional tanker flights in the last week. If additional flight time is being spent, it means that the airspace the aircraft has to monitor is becoming crowded. However, this measure remains reactive against the Gripen RB-99 combination. This is because the AMRAAM's radar head does not require semi-active illumination even on final approach. By the time the trace detected by the A-50U is converted into data and reaches the battery, the engagement window is closed. Moscow's only real antidote is to keep its Kibini U and L-175V hybrid electronic jamming pods in large numbers. But the confirmed success rate of Kibini against the AIM-120 family is limited. The false Echo programs loaded into Russia's PKK-C, Rook, and Armored Threat Radar operating modes are quickly eliminated due to the AMRAAM's low side lobe detection algorithm. Let's turn to Ukraine. When RB-99s are deployed in F-16 cockpits, an air defense screen will form at medium altitude to intercept targets illuminated by Patriot radars. In fact, Kiev's plan is 2-layered, to shave down drone swarms approaching cities from below with the growing Sky Sentinel tower network, and to strike the remaining cruise missiles at medium altitude with RB-99s and the Patriot dual-shoot procedure. This double-shot technique adds 15% to the kill probability in arrival kinematics and target prediction accuracy equations. In a world where missiles are expensive, every missed shot burns a hole in the budget. The RB-99 is cheaper than the Patriot, and the Patriot's radar is invisible to the RB-99. For relatively expensive missiles, such as Caliber or KH-101, such layered defense reverses the Kremlin's cost-effectiveness graph. According to data from the Economist Intelligence Unit, Moscow's monthly missile drone expenditure is currently around $350 million. When Kiev's layered defense with Western stockpiles comes into play, the cost per unit destroyed will triple. This economic erosion will inevitably slow down the pace of attacks. This is because Rostec's feedback capacity is limited and its petrodollar revenues are in a bottleneck due to sanctions. The geopolitical dimension in the Baltic Black Sea ring is also intensifying. Sweden's official entry into NATO was completed last year, but air policing duties have been ongoing since 2015. Those patrols are now evolving into active deterrence. When the Gripen flight route extends over Gotland to Poland, the Kaliningrad corridor narrows. At the same time, Romania's F-16 fleet is increasing the number of patrols in the Black Sea. In between, with Turkish F-16s flying the Aegean Black Sea route and AWACS on shift, Russia is caught on combined radar almost every time it takes off. Kaliningrad's already limited runway capacity is feeling the pressure from both Sweden and Poland. At this point, the strategic question is unavoidable. Are we ready for the Scandinavian dome? Building defenses with concrete and iron instead of electronic waves is not a concept that has been tested in history. The new doctrine relies on 2 gaps on the ground. First, Russia lacks the platforms to deploy its electronic warfare capabilities in the Baltic with equal force. Kibini U-pods are limited, and as MiG-31BMs are deployed on additional missions, engine hours are increasing, and maintenance and spare parts cycles are lengthening. Second, due to economic embargoes, the Kremlin is forced to source every range upgrade from the Chinese market. The AMRAAM production chain, however, still has controlled components status. This means that when Washington clicks to increase its order, production capacity can be ramped up to 3 shifts. But when Moscow's integrated circuit gets jammed, containers from Shanghai wait for weeks at the border. This difference in supply speed is reflected in the field as a monthly rather than an annual impact. Ultimately, Sweden's AMRAAM swap is more than just a change in ammunition inventory on paper. In the Baltic skies, code lines, logistics, finance, and psychology intertwine. Every missile box sent out builds a wall around a Patriot site in the Black Sea, thickening the low-altitude canopy over Ukrainian cities. How much longer can the ruble withstand this heat? Can Russia sustain its drone swarm? Nothing is certain. What is certain is that the first beam of the Scandinavian dome narrative was laid by the Gripen jets, the second by the Patriot, and the third is coming from the RB-99 stockpile. When these 3 beams are fully in place, the sky over the Baltic and Black Seas will become a single metal reflection, a single voice of the data network. When that day comes, Russia will have no sky to fly its drone swarms, no hidden exit route to launch its calibers, and perhaps not a single ruble left in the Defense Ministry's budget. and the whole domino will fall with a signature, a tweet, and a few old but golden RB99s. This whole picture also amplifies the psychological pressure. Sweden's Link 22 integration provides a multi-layered close air picture by sharing real-time data with Polish F-16s and Norwegian F-35s. Russian pilots are moving on a chessboard where their post-takeoff mission parameters are constantly being updated. Every blue warning tone echoes in the cockpit as a potential risk that could cancel the mission. At the strategic level, as the Kremlin directs more spare parts and personnel to the Baltic to maintain air superiority in the north, gaps will open up in southern logistics along the Rostov-Voronezh-Belgorod line, weakening the supply chain to Crimea and allowing Ukraine to increase pressure on its land and sea fronts. Thank you for watching.
The region's governor says at least 4 people were injured after what they're describing as a massive strike. That follows a possible drone attack overnight on a Russian oil refinery.
Russia is engulfed in flames. The lifelines of Russia's war machine melted away in 3 explosions on July 22 to 33, 2025. There are 3 critical pillars that give Russia its confidence in war: the chemical plants that feed its explosive production lines, the fuel refineries that keep its air and land vehicles running, and the energy and communications backbone that connects its troops behind the front lines. In the last week of July, Ukraine struck all of these pillars in quick succession. First, strikes disabled Russia's largest petrochemical complex in the Samara region, followed by a second wave that shut down a high-capacity refinery in the same city. The following night, the successive targeting of a thermal power plant, a regional railway junction, and Rostelecom's main data center in Vovchansk made it clear that the attack was no coincidence. For Moscow, the result was not just zeros added to the fire reports, it was a chain reaction that ranged from the speed of artillery fire to the tempo of air sorties to the labels on food shelves. So how did Ukraine target these facilities, overcome Russian defenses, and cripple the Russian war machine? All 3 targets were hit by a single actor: the Ukrainian Armed Forces low radar signature UJ-26 Boba swarm. Let's start with the chemical plant. Andrei Kovalenko, head of the Disinformation Response Center affiliated with Ukraine's National Security and Defense Council, reported on Tuesday, July 22, that an attack had been carried out on a facility belonging to the Novokuybishevsk petrochemical company in Russia's Samara region. Kovalenko stated that the facility produced raw materials for explosives, including benzene, phenol, acetone, alpha-methyl styrene, synthetic ethyl alcohol, and paratert butyl phenol. The CPD chairman explained that these components are used in the production of TNT, hexagen, tetryl, and other types of explosives used to equip artillery shells, aircraft bombs, fragmentation munitions, and rockets. Indeed, this facility was of great importance. The Novokuybishevsk petrochemical complex, with an annual processing capacity of 1 million tons, serves as the backbone of Russia's high-explosive raw material production. Aromatic hydrocarbons such as benzene and phenol enter nitration reactors here, undergo several stages of processing, and are transformed into precursor components of TNT and RDX. These intermediates are shipped to filling lines in the Urals, where they form the explosive content of 122 and 152 mm artillery shells. The first target of the attack on the facility was the raw benzene storage tanks. The exposed flames rapidly expanded the mixture inside the pressurized pipe within seconds. Within a short time, 3 nitration towers exceeded the safe operational limit and triggered an emergency shutdown. The line was completely shut down until a water wall was established to cool the process at the facility due to the risk of leakage. Although this decision appears to have been an environmental accident prevention measure, it had a direct negative impact on the stock of explosives destined for the front line. Satellite images of the area indicate that the diameter and rise time of the initial explosions were low, suggesting low payload but highly accurate kamikaze drones. The UJ-26 Boba, which has been mentioned frequently in recent times, is a possible example of this. According to open sources, the body length is around 3 meters, with a delta-shaped wingspan of 2.5 meters. Thanks to its low infrared signature, it engages low-altitude weapons at the Pantsir level rather than the S-300. It is claimed that a GLONASS GPS hybrid module and image recognition package are combined for guidance. This allows it to select the target tower from stored reference photos without an external connection during the last 5 kilometers of its route. The real critical point is range. targets struck more than 100 kilometers deep inside Russian territory show that the UAV took off from inside Ukraine and passed through a very wide S-300 coverage area. The reason why air defense radars cannot detect Bobber is that its radar cross-section is close to that of a bird and does not produce reflections at certain wavelengths. Bobber, or a similar body, at least opened the first wave. Hours later, on the morning of July 22nd, residents of Novokuibishevsk in the Samara region reported powerful explosions. Ukraine carried out a successful attack with unmanned aerial vehicles on a Russian strategic facility. Sources reported that at least 2 UAVs reached their targets, the Novokuibishevsk oil refinery. A direct hit caused a fire at the facility. Industrial areas were engulfed in flames. The Novokuibishevsk refinery is located next to a chemical complex. The Novokuibishevsk refinery is part of Rosneft and is of key importance for oil refining in the Volga region. Among other things, it produces fuel for jet engines. It produces high-quality bitumen and RT fuel, the main type of aviation kerosene in demand by Russian military aviation. It processes 8,800,000 tons of crude oil annually and produces RT-class jet fuel for the Russian Air Force. The standout feature is not just the volume but the production process, which can be redirected to the front lines in a very short time. This means that the thousands of tons of kerosene stored here can be transported to Engels Air Base or the helicopter landing pads in Voronezh within a day if needed. The second wave heading for the refinery hit the distillation tower and the hydrocracker line. The technical team acknowledged in the first hour that operations had been shut down and cooling was expected. In short, the general shutdown meant that crude oil input had stopped and output was close to zero. As soon as the Air Command received this statement, it reduced its sortie plans on the southern and western fronts by 45%. Tanker flights had to take fuel from the eastern region, increasing both flight time and costs. The following night, in the Rostov region, was the second act of the strategic coup. On the night of July 23rd, an intense attack by unmanned aerial vehicles was carried out on Novocherkassk in the Rostov region, causing destruction and fires in the city. The railway infrastructure, a regional power plant, and a Rostelecom building were under attack. The Novocherkasskaya thermal power plant provides load balancing for both regional industry and the railway signaling network. Around midnight, Russian media reported that pieces of the allegedly downed UAVs had caused a fire in the center of Novocherkassk. According to the Russians, explosions also occurred near the Novocherkasskaya thermal power plant. The drone attack caused power outages in Novocherkassk. A single drone carrying a 75-kilogram payload halved Russia's combat capability for a few seconds. On the night of July 31, a highly critical Russian factory complex was targeted by Ukraine's long-range drones, and this attack reached proportions that could alter the course of the war. 11 consecutive explosions silenced the command factory, which the Kremlin had deemed untouchable, within seconds. The Ukrainian Center for Countering Disinformation identified the target as the Radio Works factory in Penza, an important facility of the Russian military-industrial complex. The attack by the Luity drone disabled the Radiozavod complex in seconds, causing enough damage to cripple Russia's command and control system. The Penza operation was challenging. The facility, located approximately 700 kilometers from the front lines, was not a target for artillery shells, but a nerve center transmitting target coordinates. For this reason, Ukrainian forces needed to use a vehicle with both high explosive capacity and long-range capabilities. For this reason, the Luity drone was chosen as the main strike force in the operation. The AN-196 Luity was the most suitable for this operation, due to its high destructive capacity and long range. Local authorities confirmed that there was a large fire at the factory after residents shared videos of drones flying low over the city. Footage posted on social media by Penza residents clearly shows the Luity drone flying toward the critical Russian facility and striking it. The Luity has a range of approximately 1,000 kilometers and can fly at speeds of 250 to 300 kilometers per hour, making them a highly efficient threat capable of operating deep inside Russian territory. Additionally, it can carry up to 75 kilograms of explosive material. Furthermore, the Lyuti is equipped with thermobaric warheads, meaning these UAVs possess the destructive power to obliterate the entire structure of a target by combining explosive force with oxygen. Such warheads cause severe damage to the target's internal structure, rendering sensitive electronic systems such as radar stations and communication centers completely inoperable. In the initial phase of the operation, Ukrainian UAV teams and intelligence units identified Russia's most critical targets. These targets typically included command and control centers, radar systems, logistics infrastructure, and military facilities. Ukraine's goal was to cripple Russia's air defense networks and command and control capabilities. The first step in crippling the Russian factory was to direct the Lyuti toward its target. The Lyuti uses traditional aircraft takeoff methods using fixed landing gear. This design allows it to take off from improvised runways, such as highways, without the need for special runways. Ukraine made a plan that required great coordination when launching the operation. Before Lyuti and its supporting long-range jammers began flying toward their targets on the ground, routes and targeting points were determined in detail for all UAVs. At this stage, different flight routes were planned for each drone, based on its mission, along with coordinates supported by deceptive signals, and a precise approach plan toward the targets. First, a strategy was implemented to deceive Russian air defense systems during the approach to the targets. Lyuti UAVs use a hybrid navigation package based on GLONASS mimicry, unlike traditional navigation systems. This system is designed to provide false coordinates during flight to deceive enemy radars. The system, which detects the target's location and directs itself toward it, confuses the radars and diverts the attention of Russian air defense systems. As a result, enemy defenses are rendered passive, and the UAV can be easily directed toward the target. Lyuti successfully deceived Russian radars, keeping the target's real coordinates hidden. This made it difficult to detect targets and activate defense systems. Additionally, each drone was equipped to transmit deceptive signals capable of disabling enemy radars. When the plug was pulled, all batteries were plunged into darkness. The UAVs set off for their designated targets and reached Russia's internal lines, launching their attack. Timing was critical to the success of the attack. As the targets were very far away, it was essential to pay close attention to the range and speed capabilities of the UAVs. In the first minutes of the attack, the high-gain antenna towers that were set ablaze disrupted approximately 70% of the real-time coordination traffic, providing coordinates to the howitzer batteries stationed on the southern front. In the first strike, the high-gain antenna towers at the radio plant were disabled within the first seconds of the explosion. These antennas were of critical importance for providing target coordinates to Russian artillery. Secondary explosions triggered by the initial blast targeted Russia's air defense radars and command centers. Lyuti UAVs, specifically targeting these objectives, crippled Russia's radar capabilities across the entire country. This limited Russia's ability to identify targets on the front lines and enhanced Ukraine's maneuverability. 11 explosions recorded simultaneously at the Penza radio plant complex triggered an unprecedented disruption in Russia's command and control network since the start of the war. Tens of thousands of kilometers of fiber optic lines, Rostec-made C4ISR modules, and 46 billion rubles worth of signal processing traffic per year were shut down with a single press of a button by a 75-kilogram bomb. This is because Zavod was the main port that fed target data to thousands of Russian units, from howitzers on the southern front to strategic missile batteries. In fact, this facility, located hundreds of kilometers from the front lines, served as the brain center for C4ISR production under the Rostec umbrella. A significant portion of the communication lines transmitting target updates to Russian artillery units were fed directly from this location. The Russian Federation is burning, and this time it's for real. This is not a metaphor, but a real-time map of fires across the country. On the same night, Ukrainian drones targeted an industrial nerve center that runs the length of Russia with surgical precision. The drone swarms focused on simultaneously pressuring the fuel supply, takeoff runways and command and control networks. Each target was carefully selected to directly impact the firing rate of an artillery battery at the front, the sortie of an airfield, or the movement of a supply convoy. The first reports of explosions came from Lipetsk. Explosions near the military airfield in the area caused short-term chaos in the airspace. Although local authorities initially reported a fire in a motor vehicle depot, open-source Sentinel-2 data and images from the site showed that the incident affected Yak-130 training jets and Su-34 maintenance shelters. The Su-34s departing from there were typically tasked with carrying Kh-29, Kh-59 tactical cruise missile packages toward Kharkiv. Damage to 3 points of the runway infrastructure led to takeoff restrictions. Subsequent information from Ryazan revealed that the situation was far more extensive. A fire broke out around the city's large oil refinery. The speed and intensity detected by NASA VIIR's infrared sensors confirmed a temperature profile consistent with fully loaded crude oil tanks, as reported by civilian monitoring networks. At the same time, explosions were heard over the strategically important Dyagilevo military airfield. This base is known as one of the main hubs for Russia's long-range bombing capabilities. It is estimated that the base's fuel supply infrastructure could be operational again within 6 to 8 weeks. Considering Russia's Tu-22 M3 maintenance rotation schedule, the missile salvo capacity over the Black Sea will experience at least 2 full sorties of downtime. In the Voronezh region, intense explosions lit up the night sky. Local sources reported that the flames rising in the area appeared after Russia's air defense systems were activated. This indicates that the attacks resulted in both direct hits on targets and secondary effects caused by air defense. One of the heaviest damages occurred near Samara. Ukrainian drones struck the Novokoybishevsky refinery, owned by state energy giant Rosneft. Located just 19 kilometers outside the city center of Samara, this facility is one of Russia's largest and most critical refineries. Fuel produced here is pumped into export pipelines, sent to military fuel depots, and forms the backbone of regional logistics. The facility, which is subject to US sanctions, was engulfed in a massive fire after being hit. Following the attack, Samara Airport was closed to flights, and mobile internet was cut off in the area. Firefighters began emergency response efforts to protect Rosneft's remaining assets. 2 of the 3 reactor groups in the CDU-VDU line, which has a daily processing capacity of 200,000 barrels of crude oil, were shut down. The damage, which is expected to take more than a week to repair, is estimated to cost Rosneft $32 million in daily revenue. Not only local production but also fuel flows to Black Sea ports via the Volga Basin have decreased by 10%. The diversion of RZD freight trains operating in the same corridor to secondary routes for diesel refueling is directly affecting the speed of artillery and ammunition convoys advancing to the front. In the medium term, this logistical pressure will reduce the supply frequency to the Zaporizhia-Donetsk front. Another location attacked was Penza. The target here was the Elektra Pribor facility, a critical component of the Russian military-industrial complex. This factory produces digital network equipment used in military control systems, as well as high-precision devices for aircraft, armored vehicles, warships, and even space vehicles. The Primorsko-Atarsk military airbase on the Azov Sea coast was targeted by Ukrainian drones. However, this was not an ordinary base attack. Because Primorsko-Atarsk is not just a runway, it is one of the main coordination and launch centers for Russia's Shahed and Geran-type suicide drone attacks against Ukraine. Iranian-made Shahed 136s and Russian-made Geran 2s have been taking off from this base for months, striking Ukraine's energy infrastructure, grain terminals, schools, and civilian areas. Russia viewed these unmanned vehicles as a strategic advantage, low cost, difficult to detect, and effective in psychological warfare. But Ukraine has now turned its attention to the source of this threat. The attack was multi-layered and highly accurate. Within minutes, both the launch pads and the areas where the drones were stored were engulfed in flames. The strikes on the runway completely halted takeoff operations. Widespread explosions occurred in fuel and ammunition storage areas. The most striking information, however, emerged as Russia attempted to conceal the extent of the damage. NASA's MODIS and VIIR's satellites revealed the reality that the Kremlin sought to hide. They simultaneously recorded multiple fire points over Primorsko-Atarsk. The Ukrainian security service stated that the target of the attack was not only the runway but also drone storage facilities and command infrastructure. The shelters, which were started to be built in late 2024 and designed to protect unmanned aerial vehicles from air attacks, were likely among the targeted sites. However, the problem is that these structures were built based on the principles of rapid production and low cost. Therefore, they were not resistant to drone attacks. Those shelters are now burning, emitting a red light into the dark night. A video circulating online and quickly going viral clearly shows Ukrainian-made long-range unmanned aerial vehicles striking the Shahed ammunition depot in Primorsko-Ahtarsk with pinpoint accuracy. The SBU has officially confirmed the authenticity of the footage. Russia not only lost the exit route for the martyrs, but also found its drone superiority shaken, because Primorsko-Ahtarsk was the closest attack platform to the northern coast of the Black Sea. The drones launched from there targeted cities such as Odessa, Mykolaiv, Zaporizhia, and Dnipro. Now this exit point is largely non-functional. At the same time, explosion sounds were heard along the eastern coast of Crimea, near Feodosia. Ukrainian drones targeted a large oil storage facility in Feodosia. The area was engulfed in flames. This facility was one of the key centers for fuel distribution along the Black Sea coast. The explosions were followed by huge fires, and the area was evacuated. The attack did not stop there. New explosions were heard near Kerch, and the Crimean bridge was immediately closed to traffic. This means that Russia's most important land supply route to Crimea has been temporarily cut off. The security risk level was raised, and both vehicle and train traffic on the bridge were suspended. The success of these attacks is not only due to Ukraine's technological advances, but also to fundamental weaknesses in Russia's air defense architecture. These weaknesses are particularly evident in the concept of radar saturation. Every radar system has a certain tracking and target separation capacity. Especially when multiple targets, with low radar cross-sections, approach simultaneously from different directions, the system's tracking memory, signal processing circuits, and data link traffic can quickly reach a saturation point. This is exactly what happened on the day of the attack.